A Montana blizzard is merciless, devouring sound, hiding danger, erasing tracks. Yet through the roaring hush of one such storm slips a noise too fragile for the wind to claim. A single, broken whimper. It hovers between snow-choked pines and reaches the ears of Jonah Ridge, a reclusive ranger who hasn't answered anyone's call, human or otherwise, in years. He tries to dismiss it as wind against bark, but the cry threads itself through memories of a family he once failed to save. Lantern in hand, rifle on his shoulder, Jonah steps off his safe, familiar path and trudges into a world gone white. There, buried beneath ice-crusted branches, lies a German shepherd pub-leading, freezing, and cornered by a hunger-crazed bear. One heartbeat, one rifle shot, and one impossible decision collide, setting in motion a rescue that will thaw more than winter's grip. Keep watching to discover how that faint cry not only saves the pup's life, but drags Jonah back into the warmth of hope he thought forever lost. The wind slid like blades between the pine trunks, hissing low and constant, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Snow blanketed the forest floor in unbroken white, softening even the crunch of Jonah Merrick's boots as he trudged the trail he had walked 1,000 times. Above him, the sky sagged with dense gray clouds, heavy with more snow to come. But Jonah didn't mind the cold. He welcomed it. At 62, the wilderness was the only companion that didn't ask for conversation. He preferred it that way. His beard had gone to silver, his hands thick with calluses. He had built this life around the stillness off-grid, off-radar, far from the memory-laced roads that twisted back to faces he couldn't bear to remember. These woods were his retreat, his atonement, and his penance. He walked with the practiced rhythm of someone who belonged to the land. One hand rested loosely on the strap of his old pack, the other in his coat pocket, fingers curled around a pocket knife that hadn't seen blood in years. Not animal blood, not his own, not since. Then he heard it. At first, it was so faint he thought it was a trick of the Winda Creek, maybe, or the whimper of some distant limb bowing under ice. But it came again. A soft, thin sound. A whine. Not the cry of a bird. Not the crack of frost. Something alive. Jonah stopped, head tilted. The sound came from off the trail, tucked somewhere between the gnarled roots and snowdrifts that swallowed everything in silence. Probably a fox, he muttered to no one, voice dry and gravelly from days without use. Still, his boots didn't move forward. The sound came again, short, clipped, pleading, something small, wounded. He turned his head toward the thicket. "Don't do it," a voice said in the back of his mind. That same voice that warned him not to care anymore, that nothing good ever came from following cries in the dark. But then there was another, voice quieter, older, the one that had once pulled him out of bed at dawn 20 years ago, when his daughter's cough sounded off. The one that made him stop the truck in the middle of a snowstorm because he thought he saw a shape on the road. Jonah sighed, "Damn it." He stepped off the trail. The powder was deep, rising past his boots. Every branch was heavy with snow, bending low like it was bowing in grief. He moved slowly, brushing aside spruce limbs and brambles that clawed at his coat. The deeper he went, the louder the sound became, barely louder than his breath, but enough to follow. Then he saw it. Tucked against a fallen log, nearly buried by drift and slush, was a shape too small to be a deer, too still to be wild. A puppy. No, not just any puppy. His coat, matted and bloodied, was distinct even beneath the Crimea sable and black pattern Jonah knew well. German shepherd, maybe 4 or 5 months old. Long limbs still clumsy in proportion. His hind leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. One ear flopped. The other was torn. Jonah's breath caught, fogging in front of him. The dog lifted its head barely, eyes glazed and dull. And then another sound. A branch snapping, low and deliberate. Jonah's spine went rigid. He turned. From the thicket ahead, a shadow moved, massive, lumbering, brown. A bear. Jonah's pulse pounded against his ribs. It emerged without sound except for the heavy exhale of its breath. A grizzly, easily 600 pounds, its coat thick with snowmelt. Its eyes locked not on Jonah but the puppy. Jonah's fingers moved before thought. His rifle swung over his shoulder. He clicked off the safety. He didn't yell, didn't make a show of himself. He simply raised the barrel and fired into the air. The crack shattered the forest's silence. The bear halted mid-step, its head jerking up. It snorted, ears twitching, and gave a low growl more insult than threat before turning back into the trees. Branches shattered as it moved, vanishing into shadow. The quiet returned, but not the calm. Jonah stood frozen, rifle lowered, heart hammering. He turned back toward the pup. The little body lay in the snow, blood blooming in the slush beneath, still breathing. Barely. And for a moment, Jonah did nothing. Just stared. He should leave. Let nature finish what it started. That was the rule out here, don't interfere with what you can't carry. But his legs moved anyway, knees bending, fingers unclipping his ranger jacket. He lowered it gently over the dog, hands trembling not from the cold but from something older, something like grief or guilt. "I've got you," he whispered, not knowing why the words came or who they were really for. The dog didn't move, but under Jonah's palm, he felt it a heartbeat, fragile, but still there. The snow grew deeper with every step, the air tighter. Jonah's boots sank past his ankles as he pushed through a thicket of pine branches, ice crackling beneath the weight of his coat. The sound was closer, now sporadic, weak, like a breath running out of time. He pulled back a frozen limb, and there, half buried beneath wind-packed snow, was the source. A German Shepherd puppy. Jonah's breath caught. The dog was crumpled near the base of a fallen log, his small frame trembling violently. Mud and twigs clung to his fur, patches matted with ice and something darker blood. His ears were uneven, one torn and curled against his skull. A back leg dragged uselessly behind him. His chest rose in shallow jerks, and each movement looked like it cost him more than he had. Jonah crouched slowly, the snow creaking beneath his knees. No collar, no tags, no fresh human scent. Just the smell of iron, dirt, and something older. Something that didn't belong to this pup, but to the forest itself. Predatory. The puppy didn't bark, didn't cry. He just looked at Jonah with dull, amber eyes too old for his small frame, as if he already knew what came next, as if he was ready for it. And Jonah? He didn't know what made his hand move, reaching into his coat, fingers brushing against the inner lining of the jacket like he might wrap the pup in it right there. But something in him cracked just slightly under the weight of that broken stare. Then it happened. A low rumble rolled across the snow. Not thunder, not wind, something grounded, heavy. Jonah's spine stiffened. He turned slowly. The woods to his left shifted. From between the trees, a massive brown blur emerged, silent until it wasn't. The grizzly's head swung low, its breath puffing in hot clouds that vanished almost as fast as they came. Its eyes didn't blink. Its path didn't waver. It was coming straight for them. Jonah moved in a single breath fluid, precise. Years of muscle memory guiding his hands. He stood, rifle already coming off his back, boots planted firm in the crusted snow. The bear didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. Its focus wasn't on Jonah hit, was on the pup behind him. Jonah raised the rifle, cold metal settling into his shoulder like an old friend, and fired. The shot cracked through the forest like a lightning strike. The bear skidded to a halt. Snow sprayed from under its paws. It stood upright for a moment, massive shoulders rippling, then dropped back to all fours with a deep grunt. Its ears twitched. Its breath came louder, now more annoyed than afraid. For a long second, it didn't move. Jonah kept the rifle raised, breath steady, finger ready. One more step, and he wouldn't aim wide. The bear huffed, snarled once low, and turned. It stomped into the brush, its retreat splintering branches and shaking snow from the trees like a storm passing through. In seconds, it was gone. But the tension it left behind felt like a wire pulled tight in Jonah's chest. He exhaled slow, controlled, and then he turned back to the puppy. The little body hadn't moved. Jonah knelt again, rifle slung back over his shoulder, hands hovering above the fragile form. The puppy was still breathing, barely. His leg clawed deep, muscle exposed bowled into the snow, staining it in a bloom of red. One of his ribs jutted at a strange angle, and when Jonah gently brushed a hand along his side, the pup flinched. "I know," Jonah muttered under his breath. "Easy." He pulled off his jacket, laying it across the snow. Then, as carefully as he could manage, he slid the pup into the middle of it, folding the thick fabric over him like a makeshift cocoon. Blood soaked through almost immediately, but the warmth of the jacket seemed to steady the dog's trembling just a little. Jonah gathered the bundle into his arms. The pup didn't resist. He didn't whine. He just existed there, in Jonah's grasp, small, broken, and devastatingly light. The silence returned. But it was different now. It wasn't the kind that meant peace. It was the kind that meant urgency. Jonah rose to his feet, adjusted the weight in his arms, and glanced once more toward the trees where the bear had disappeared. His eyes narrowed, his jaw locked. Then he turned and began moving fast, deliberate back toward the trail, boots crunching through crusted snow, heart pounding against ribs that hadn't felt this alive in years. The wind picked up again behind him. Somewhere deep in the forest, another branch snapped. But Jonah didn't look back. He had something to carry now, and he wasn't going to let it die. The trees closed in behind him, their shadows long and unmoving. The snow came thicker now, no longer drifting, but falling hard, angled by the wind like a warning. Jonah didn't slow. Each step back toward the trail was a test. His boots skidded over slick roots buried beneath the powder. His knees ached with every shift of weight, and the bundle in his arm small as it grew heavier with every breath the pup took, and every one he didn't. The dog was quiet now, not unconscious, but quiet in that terrifying way that meant the pain had passed into something else, something colder. His head lolled against Jonah's forearm, tongue peeking slightly between his teeth. Snowflakes melted instantly against the heat of his blood-soaked fur, vanishing like they'd never touched him. Jonah didn't look down. Not yet. He knew that kind of silence. He'd seen it before on the side of mountain roads, after a crash. In the eyes of a man holding on to life by a thread too thin to name. That silence wasn't surrender. It was suspension. A moment caught between staying and going. He stepped over a downed log, the puppy stirring slightly with the jolt. That was enough. By the time Jonah reached the edge of the clearing where the trail curved back toward his cabin, his breath came in thick, burning pulls. His coat clung to him by one arm, the rest wrapped tight around the pup, cinched at the chest to hold the fragile frame in place. The heat from the puppy's body was faint, but still there. A thread, and Jonah wasn't about to let it go. He dropped to his knees near the base of a pine, cradling the dog in the nest of wool and faded ranger green. The snow around them was stained in wide patches, now deep red blooming beneath the jacket, seeping through like ink in water. He unwrapped one side to check. His breath caught in his throat. The dog's side was torn open, 3 deep lacerations raking across the ribs. One paw hung limp at an unnatural angle. His fur was stuck in clumps of sap, blood, and frost like the forest had tried to keep him, and he'd only barely escaped. His breathing was shallow, unsteady. But there, Jonah pressed a hand gently to the pup's ribs, trying to gauge rhythm, trying to feel something constant. "I've got you," he muttered, voice cracking. 3 words, barely a whisper. But they cut through the storm around him like a flare in the dark. And somehow, in saying them, they became true. He didn't know why those words came. He hadn't said them in years, not since the last time someone had needed him, really needed him. But the moment they left his lips, something shifted like the act of claiming this fragile life was enough to make him responsible for it. Jonah wrapped the jacket tighter. He ran his palm once over the pup's head, fingers tracing behind the ears, where the fur was still soft untouched by blood or snow. The dog didn't flinch, just breathed, slow, staggered, but alive. The wind roared through the trees again. Snow slashed across the clearing in sudden, sharp bursts. It would get worse before it let up. Jonah didn't waste another second. He stood, groaning under the strain more emotional than physical. His shoulder burned from the rifle, but he didn't shift it. His arms wrapped the pup closer to his chest. The coat clutched like a second skin. The warmth was faint, but it was his now. A life, bundled up inside something broken, something stubborn, something still beating. He started walking. Each footfall was deliberate. The trees blurred at the edges of his vision. The only sound he focused on was the soft whisper of breath against his chest fading, but real. He didn't talk, didn't shout. Just moved forward, as if moving alone could keep death at bay. Minutes passed, or hours. He couldn't tell. By the time the silhouette of his cabin emerged through the snow, Jonah's legs were shaking, not from fatigue, but from the fear of arriving too late. The fear that this time, the fight might not be enough. He reached the porch, threw the door open with one shoulder, and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, cold, but the fire from that morning still glowed in the belly of the stove. He dropped to his knees in front of it and laid the bundle gently onto a folded wool blanket. The heat from the fire touched the dog's side, coaxing a twitch from one paw. Still here, still holding on. Jonah grabbed a dry towel from the hooks by the hearth, gently patting around the wounds, careful not to press. Blood soaked through the towel in seconds, but he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. I know, he murmured more to himself than the dog. And then, as if waking from a trance, he looked around at the shelves, the jars, the maps on the wall. None of it mattered now. He stood, crossed the room, grabbed the truck keys off the nail near the window. He looked down once more at the dog wrapped in his jacket. Eyes closed, chest rising slow. "You don't die here," he said, voice low but certain. "Not tonight." And with that, he scooped the pup back into his arms and stepped once more into the snow. The storm didn't stop, but neither did he. The truck door slammed shut with a hollow metallic thud, echoing into the snowy dark like a shot fired too late. Jonah's breath fogged in front of him, thick and shallow. He slid behind the wheel, cranked the ignition once, twice before the engine caught with a reluctant roar, coughing cold diesel into the wind. The heater groaned to life like an old man waking up too fast. Jonah didn't wait. The puppy, still wrapped in the ranger jacket, now streaked with frozen blood and melting snow, was curled tightly on the passenger seat. His small frame barely made a dent in the cushion, but to Jonah, he took up all the space in the world. A bundle of silence and weight. A life teetering on the edge. Jonah shifted into gear. The tires spun once, then caught traction, lurching them forward onto the snow-packed road that wound down from the cabin like a thread unraveling through the trees. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow slapped the windshield in frantic diagonal slashes. The wipers struggled to keep up, scraping a narrow arc of visibility, barely wide enough to see the next curve. Jonah hunched over the wheel, squinting through the blur of white and shadow. The dashboard thermometer blinked red, 17 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping. He reached over with one hand, checking the pup beneath the jacket. Still warm, still breathing, if only just. That was all that mattered. "Hold on, kid," he muttered. 40 miles. You just hang on for 40 damn miles. He pressed the accelerator harder. The old truck groaned in protest, fishtailing slightly on a downhill bend before regaining grip. Jonah kept one hand tight on the wheel, the other hovering just above the pup. Every bump in the road sent a tremor through both of them. The dog didn't stir, not even a twitch. Jonah swallowed hard. The road narrowed as it dipped into the pine gorge trees, closing in from both sides, snow building fast across the asphalt. He could barely see the yellow lines, now buried under an inch of powder that hadn't been there an hour ago. If he slid off here, no one would find them until spring. He reached for the defrost and turned it up. The heat blasted the windshield, but the ice kept crawling back like frostbite, finding skin. The air inside smelled like diesel and blood and something rawer fear. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that settles low in the gut and doesn't say a word. Jonah glanced at the dog again. The pup's eyes were closed, but his chest rose barely, as if every breath asked permission, as if breathing was a decision being renegotiated moment by moment. "Don't do that," Jonah said, louder this time. "Don't you start quitting on me now. I didn't shoot a bear and bust out of hell's snow globe just so you could give up halfway there." His voice cracked on the last word. He gritted his teeth and leaned in closer to the windshield, trying to make out the upcoming turn near the frozen creek bed stretch he knew too well, a place where the road dipped just enough to catch ice that never melted. The truck slid again. He corrected, muscles locked, knuckles white against the steering wheel. The radio stayed off. The silence between them pulsed. Then, a sound soft, almost nothing, a strained whimper. Jonah's head whipped to the side. The pup had shifted, just slightly. One paw twitched beneath the jacket. The faintest sound escaped him, pain or fear. He couldn't tell, but it was something. Still here. Jonah reached out and laid a rough, calloused hand over the dog's head. The fur beneath was damp, warm, fragile. The connection grounded him in a way the road never could. "I got you," he murmured again. "You're not alone." The truck rattled over a ridge. A pothole jarred the whole frame. Jonah sucked in breath through clenched teeth and kept driving. The snow now came sideways, whiteout conditions reducing everything beyond the hood to an endless screen of static. But he knew these roads, not because of maps, but because of memory. Every bend, every dip, every mile etched into the bones of a man who had walked them long before he'd ever driven them. Up ahead, a sign, barely visible beneath snow. Kalispell, 19 miles. A flicker of something stirred inside him. Not relief, not yet, but direction, distance. A goal measured not in miles, but in breaths the dog had left. He glanced again at the bundle beside him. Blood had seeped into the seat. Jonah didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall under the coat. Still fighting. Still worth fighting for. The tires hit another patch of ice, and the truck jerked sideways just for a second. But Jonah corrected, gritted his jaw. "Not today," he muttered. "Not for either of us." The forest blurred past on both sides, black trunks slicing through the whiteout like ghosts. Time had no meaning in that drive, just snow, breath, and the weight of something that refused to die. By the time the first faint orange glow of streetlights appeared through the swirling dark, Jonah's shoulders ached from tension. His hands had frozen around the wheel, but his chest felt something strange. Something like a thread pulling him forward, fragile and terrifying. Hope. And he wasn't ready to lose it. The road ahead was a tunnel of storm and shadows now slicing sideways like shattered glass, headlights barely piercing the void. Inside the cab, the heater coughed out warmth that never reached far enough. It was a steel box in motion, wrapped in ice and breath and blood. Jonah's hands stayed locked at 10 and 2, knuckles pale, tendons drawn tight like cable wire. He hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes. Couldn't. If he looked away from the road for more than a second, they might not make the next curve. And yet, every few heartbeats, his eyes flicked to the right, to the passenger seat, to the pup, still bundled in the ranger jacket, still so small beneath the blood-stained folds. The little German shepherd hadn't moved much. A twitch here, a paw curled closer there, but his chest rose barely visible beneath the fabric. A ghost of breath, the only proof that life was still threaded through his body. Jonah found himself whispering. He didn't know when it started. Maybe back at mile marker 22. Maybe when the tires lost traction and they skidded sideways for half a second. Maybe when he realized he needed the sound of his own voice to believe this wasn't a dream, wasn't another nightmare carved from the snow and his own guilt. "You ever seen a storm like this before, kid?" he muttered, eyes locked on the winding road ahead. "No, of course not. You're just a pup. Just a damn miracle, that's what." His voice cracked. The pup let out a sound. Faint, not quite a cry, more like breath catching on pain. A whimper, hoarse and strained, that scraped straight down Jonah's spine and hit the place in his chest he thought he'd boarded shut years ago. Jonah's throat worked. "Still with me, huh?" he whispered, this time gentler. "Good. That's good. You just keep doing that. Breathing. Whining. Hell, curse me if you want. Just don't stop." Outside, the storm howled louder. The tires thunked through a buried pothole, sending a jolt through the truck. Jonah winced. The pup didn't move. "Sorry," he said instinctively. "Road's a bastard. Nothing smooth about it. But we're getting closer, all right? Just a little more." He stole a glance at the dashboard clock. 2:27 a.m. time had become elastic-stretched and snapping back. He couldn't remember when they'd left the cabin. It felt like a lifetime ago. Back when this animal was just a sound in the dark, just a whimper buried in snow. Jonah breathed through his nose, slow and shallow. The cab smelled like pine sap, wet fur, and old pain. His eyes burned not from the wind, but from something older, something he'd carried too long without admitting it had weight. He looked again at the dog. Something in him cracked. "You remind me of someone," he murmured, voice rough like gravel under snow. "Small. Should have died 3 times over, but didn't. Because she was too damn stubborn." The pup didn't stir. Jonah kept one hand on the wheel, the other hovering just above the jacket. He didn't touch, just needed to know he could. Needed to feel that nearness. There was this doe, he continued. Last winter, shot through the flank. Some hunter thought he was a sniper. She dragged herself into my shed, laid there for 2 days. I was going to put her out of her misery. Thought it was the kind thing to do. His jaw clenched. But she didn't want that, not even close. She fought. Bit me once, trying to stand. You believe that? A dying doe had more fire in her than most men I've met. He blinked hard. You've got that same look, even now. Even half frozen and torn to hell. There's a fight in you, and I'll be damned if I'm the one who lets it go out. The headlights caught a sign buried half in snow. Emergency vet. 9 miles. Almost there. Jonah exhaled through gritted teeth. His fingers flexed around the wheel. You know, he said softly, I used to think silence was safer. That if I stayed out here long enough, with no voices, no faces, I could make peace with things. But turns out, sometimes silence doesn't protect you. Sometimes it just makes you forget how to care. The pup stirred barely. A twitch of the ear. A tremor in the breath. Jonah reached out then, finally, laid his hand over the pup's head. His fingers sank into blood-matted fur. Warm. Too warm. Fever. I'm gonna get you there, he whispered. I swear it. He didn't know why he was talking so much. He wasn't a talker, hadn't been for years, but the storm outside, the fading life inside the jacket, the pressure behind his ribsit all begged for sound, for connection, for a promise to be spoken out loud, just once, in case no one else ever heard it. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the side of the truck. Jonah corrected fast, gripping the wheel hard enough to make his wrists ache. The snow veered sideways in a blinding sweep. Then lights. Not his. Up ahead, faint and flickering, was a building. Low roof. Wooden sign. Porch lamp barely cutting through the snow. The clinic. Jonah's heart surged. He leaned toward the dog. See that? We made it. You hear me, pup? We damn well made it. No answer. But in the silence, Jonah imagined he felt it. A heartbeat beneath his palm. Weak, but there. Alive. And for now, that was enough. Jonah skidded the truck into the icy gravel lot, headlights flashing against the weathered wooden sign. Tran Veterinary, emergency after hours, ring twice. Snow hissed under the tires like steam off hot metal. His breath fogged the windshield as he threw the door open and bolted out. Jacket-clad bundle pressed tight against his chest. The pup was so still now, so terrifyingly light. Jonah didn't bother with the bell. He pounded his fist against the clinic door, knuckles slamming the wood again and again. Ellie! It's Jonah, open the damn door! The porch light flickered. No answer. Ellie, please. He looked down at the bundle in his arms. The pup's breath came in tiny jerks, barely more than tremors. Blood had seeped through the jacket sleeve now, warm and sickening. Jonah's voice broke as he shouted again, desperate, guttural, no longer caring who else in town might hear. A lock clicked, then another. The door creaked open. Just a crack. Dr. Ellie Tran stood in the warm spill of yellow light, robe thrown over scrubs, hair pulled back in a tired knot. Her eyes narrowed, instinctively cautious. Half awake, halfway into another night of grief medicine and half-slept alarms. Jonah? She began. It's 2 in the... Then she saw what he held. And everything in her changed. The caution evaporated. The door swung wide. Inside. Now. She snapped. Jonah crossed the threshold like a man chasing a heartbeat. The warmth of the clinic slammed into his skin. His boots thudded on tile, melting snow trailing behind as Ellie pointed toward the surgical prep room. Set him on the table, jacket and all. Jonah obeyed, hands trembling as he laid the pup down. The moment the coat was peeled back, the room filled with the scent of blood metallic, raw. Too much for such a small body. Ellie's mouth tightened into a grim line. What happened? She asked without looking up, already snapping on gloves. Found him up near Silver Ridge, Jonah said, voice low, hoarse. No collar, no tags. Looked like something had torn into him. A bear almost finished the job. Ellie nodded once, business mode engaged. Still breathing? Barely. She placed her stethoscope against the pup's side, leaned in close. Her brow furrowed. Faint heartbeat. Fever. Lacerations on the flank and chest some deep. Possible internal bleeding, shock's already setting in. Her voice dropped. "But he's fighting." Jonah stepped back, suddenly unsure of where to put his hands. His palms still carried the warmth of the dog's body, but the rest of him felt ice-cored, helpless. Ellie moved like a storm gathering supplies, calling out medications, prepping IVs. Her assistant, a sleepy-eyed tech named Mira, had arrived somewhere in the chaos, pulling on a smock as she helped set up suction and a warm blanket bed. The silence was now a rhythm of machines, humming, steel clinking, breath-catching. Jonah's eyes locked onto the pup. His fur was matted in places, shredded in others. One leg was bent awkwardly, ribs too visible beneath skin, but there was something in the way his paw twitched like a thread refusing to break. "I don't think he's just a stray," Jonah said quietly. Ellie looked up, brow arched. "There's something in his eyes," Jonah added, when they were open, like he's seen too much. Ellie didn't answer right away. She just nodded toward a small metal tag partially embedded in the pup's hind leg-like shrapnel. Not from a collar, from something else. She tweezed it out with care. There were numbers etched into it. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll run a trace after. Right now, we stabilize him." Jonah nodded, throat tight. "Whatever it takes." For several long minutes, no one spoke. Ellie and Mira worked in tandem administering fluids, stitching the worst wounds, shaving away fur to clean the bite. The pup whimpered once, low and fragile. Ellie's hand paused, her voice softening. "Stay with us, little one." Jonah stood at the edge of the room like a man bracing for bad news. The overhead lights were too bright, the walls too white. It smelled like antiseptic and fear. But every now and then, the pup's chest rose. Shallow, stubborn, alive. Ellie finally stepped back, sweat on her brow. "He's stable. For now. Sedated. But he's got a long road ahead." Jonah exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His hands found the edge of the counter, gripped it hard. "Thank you." Ellie peeled off her gloves, tossed them in the bin, and studied him. "You gonna tell me why you really brought him in at 2:15 in the middle of a whiteout?" Jonah looked at the dog wrapped now, in a warm fleece blanket, breathing slow and faint. "I heard something," he said. Not just his cry. Something under it. Like he wasn't supposed to be found. Like he'd been thrown away. Ellie's face shifted, something old flickering behind her eyes. A wound not yet scarred. She nodded. "Then maybe it's good you didn't let the door stay shut." The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Dr. Ellie Tran snapped on a new pair of gloves, the latex crackling like static. Her breath misted faintly in the chill of the emergency surgical suite, but her hands were steady, movements precise. The pup lay on the steel tray beneath hers maul, broken, barely a whisper of life under the blanket of heat wraps and saline. Dried blood clung to his hind leg like rust. His chest rose in short, unsteady pulses. Fever sweated through his fur. "Pulses thready," she muttered almost to herself. "BP's crashing." And Jonah stood across from her, his ranger jacket still stained and hanging off his shoulder. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white, like he was holding something insiderage, fear, both. The crash cart wheels clicked softly as Mira rolled it into position. "Prep atropine. Stat oxygen. Stat," Ellie said sharply. Mira moved with trained calm, but her eyes flicked nervously to the dog's barely moving frame. Jonah didn't blink. He didn't seem to breathe. He watched Ellie the way you watch someone defuse a bomb with a spoon. "This isn't just trauma," Ellie muttered, probing gently along the abdomen. "He's septic, internal bleeding. His organs are fighting each other." The pup let out a shallow whimper, just a thread of sound, but it cut through the room like a scream. Jonah flinched. "Hold on," he whispered. "Come on, kid. Hold on." Ellie inserted the IV catheter, her brow furrowed in ruthless focus. "He's lost too much. I need more time." "You've got it," Jonah said, voice low and tight. "Whatever you need." She didn't look up. "I need him to want it." Then came the silence. The kind that lives in surgical rooms and war zones. A beep flatlined on the vitals monitor. The room froze. "No, no, no, don't you give up," Ellie hissed, grabbing the crash paddles. "Mira, Epino." Mira slammed the syringe into the line as Ellie powered up the defibrillator. The pup's body looked impossibly small beneath the wires and clamps. His chest barely moved now. He was slipping. Clear. The first jolt made Jonah step back, heart hammering. Nothing. Ellie grit her teeth. Again clear. Another shock. The monitor fluttered. A blip. Then stillness. Jonah stepped forward. His voice cracked. Please, Ellie. One more, she snapped. Clear. The jolt pulsed through the little body. Then tick. A beep. Then another. The line pulsed. Irregular. Fragile. But there. Ellie let out a slow breath, her shoulders trembling. We're not done yet. Jonah leaned on the counter, eyes locked on the monitor like it was a lifeline. His fists slowly unclenched. Ellie moved fast, stabilizing vitals, checking the pup's gums, pulse, temp. He's got a tear in the spleen. I can stop the bleed, but if the infection spreads, we lose him anyway. I'm not letting him die on a metal tray, Jonah said through his teeth. Not after making it this far. Ellie finally looked up, met his eyes. I need to open him up. Jonah nodded. You sure? She asked. Quieter now. He stepped forward, reached down, and rested one hand on the pup's paw. It was barely warmer than the tray, but it twitched under his touch. The tiniest thing, the smallest sign of fight. Do it, he said. He's got something left. Ellie moved fast. Scalpel, clamps, gauze. The room shifted into that strange rhythm, again half chaos, half prayer. The smell of antiseptic mixed with blood. Machines beeped and whirred, the sound of life hanging in the balance. Jonah stayed close, eyes fixed on the dog, whispering things under his breath. You're not done yet, buddy. You're not just some lost thing in the snow, you hear me? Ellie worked like time was hunting them. Clamp. Suction. Suture line coming up. The pup whimpered again, a higher, sharper sound. That's it, Jonah said. You let it out. Ellie didn't smile, but her jaw eased. That's the first real response he's given. Means he's still in there. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, Ellie stepped back, gloves blood-stained and breath shaky. I've stopped the internal bleeding, cleaned out the worst of the infection sites. He's still got a fever, but it's manageable. We're not in the clear, but she glanced down at the table. He's not dying tonight. Jonah exhaled, forehead dropping into his hands. Mira wiped her eyes. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't hollow. It was earned. A silence of breath, of held ground. Jonah looked down at the pup. You got a name? The dog stirred, almost imperceptibly. Ellie raised an eyebrow. Jonah nodded once. Didn't think so. But you've got a shot now. He reached for his jacket, laid it back over the pup like armor, as if it could shield him from whatever else the world might throw. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, but the storm had shifted. Inside the clinic, a different kind of fight had begun. The silence came first, a silence so sudden, so absolute, it swallowed the sound of the storm outside. The beep of the heart monitor, the low hum of machine saw gone. Jonah's ears rang. He stared at the screen above the steel table where the pup lay, small and broken beneath the tangle of IV lines and heat pads. The green line had stopped moving. Flat, unforgiving, dead. No, Ellie whispered, eyes darting to the monitor, then to the pup's still chest. No, stay with me. Jonah didn't breathe. Couldn't. The room shrank. The edges blurred. He stepped forward like a man reaching for a ledge he couldn't see. Then Ellie moved fast, precise, fierce. Crash cart. Mira now. Her voice broke the paralysis in the room. Mira scrambled for the defibrillator, nearly knocking over a tray of gauze. Jonah backed against the wall, watching it all as if submerged in cold water. His fingers dug into the edge of the counter. The cold steel burned. Ellie ripped open the pup's tiny chest wrap, bearing ribs too fragile, fur too thin. She rubbed gel on the paddles with shaking hands. He's gone, Mira murmured, breath hitched. Not yet, Ellie said, almost growling. Jonah's fists clenched again, not from anger this time, from sheer helplessness. Ellie pressed the paddles to the dog's chest. Clear. The jolt made the pup's body twitch. Jonah flinched like he'd been hit himself. The monitor stayed flat. Mira looked away. Jonah stepped forward. Do it again, he said, voice hoarse. Ellie met his eyes just for a second and nodded. She reset the charge. Clear. Another shock tore through the stillness. Nothing. No beep. No rise. No breath. Come on, Ellie whispered. Don't you leave me now. Jonah moved beside the table. His voice cracked. You hear me, little guy? You don't get to check out like this. Not after that damn blizzard. Not after the bear. Not after I wrapped you in my coat and whispered you through the ride like it would matter. He swallowed hard. You don't get to die now. Not while I'm still standing. The air felt too thick to breathe. The snow outside battered the windows like fists. Ellie reset the paddles one last time. Sweat streaked down her temple. Last charge. Oh. Jonah's hands hovered just inches from the pup. As if by proximity he could will his heart to beat again. Clear. The body jolted one final time. The screen blinked. Then, beep. Pause. Beep. Then a slow, rhythmic blip. Faint. But there. Ellie exhaled like she'd been drowning. He's back, she whispered. Sinus rhythm returning. Mira sobbed once and turned away. Jonah didn't move. He just stared at the little rise and fall of the pup's chest. Shallow and erratic, but undeniably alive. For the first time in what felt like years, he let his lungs fill all the way to the bottom. You stubborn son of a gun, he whispered, brushing the back of his finger against the pup's paw. You did it. Ellie was already adjusting lines, switching meds, stabilizing vitals. Her hands still moved fast, but her voice had softened. We're not out of the woods. He's still critical, but we've got a rhythm. He's fighting. Jonah nodded slowly. He's got heart. Ellie glanced at him. So do you. He didn't answer. He was watching that little heartbeat on the monitor like it was the first star after a long, cold night. Outside, the snow didn't stop. But inside that small clinic room, something had shifted. Not victory. Not yet. But a beginning. A line no longer flat. A future that hadn't quit. The storm outside hadn't lessened, but inside the clinic, time moved differently now. Quieter. Heavier. The kind of silence that comes after you pull someone back from the edge and realize you're still holding your breath. Jonah sat in the hard plastic chair beside the surgical table, eyes locked on the bundle of blankets. Somewhere beneath gauze and slow-dosing IV lines, the pup lay unconscious, still alive, still here. Ellie cleaned her tools with practiced, efficient movements, but her shoulders had dropped from the rigid fight-or-flight tension they held an hour ago. She finally turned toward him, peeled off her gloves with a snap. He's stable. For now. Jonah didn't answer right away. He just stared down at the pup, his jaw tight, breath steady but shallow, like he wasn't sure yet if it was okay to let go of the adrenaline. He's tough, he finally said, voice low, like it might crack if he raised it. Should have died in the snow. Ellie stepped closer, her voice all fact and no sugarcoating. He has a fractured rear leg, deep lacerations along his flank, borderline hypothermia. Internal bruising we'll have to monitor hourly. He's not out of the woods. She paused. And he won't be, unless someone's with him. Every day. For weeks. Jonah looked up. His eyes, dark and rimmed in red, didn't blink. I'll take him. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a decision. It was a declaration. Ellie raised a brow. Jonah? He didn't flinch. You're not exactly set up for this, she continued carefully. You live off the ridge road. The cabin barely has heat. You're gone in the field most days. This isn't just about food and water. It's meds, wound flushing, rehab, infection watch. You screw up even once. I won't, he said flatly. The silence stretched again, brittle this time. Ellie crossed her arms. I'm not saying you don't care. I'm saying this is a commitment. He could get worse. He might not walk right, might not make it. You ready to wake up every 2 hours to check his temperature? Inject antibiotics while he whimpers and fights you? Watch him relapse after 3 good days? Jonah looked down. A small paw shifted under the blanket, barely a twitch, but real, alive. He exhaled through his nose. When he spoke again, it was with a voice that sounded more like gravel than words. He's got fight in him. Another pause. I won't let it go to waste. Something shifted in Ellie's expression, something soft, almost sad. She'd known Jonah long enough to know what that sentence really meant. That it wasn't just about the dog. She nodded, once. All right. Jonah ran a hand down his face. His fingers brushed the scar near his left temple that hadn't faded even after all these years. He didn't mention the other scars, the ones under the jacket, under the silence. The ones this broken pup somehow made ache less. I'll come by tomorrow with more gauze and a splint cast, Ellie said. You'll need to pick up the meds from Milner. She opens at 7. I'll write the dosage out in detail. No improvising. He nodded. She'll need painkillers, Mira added softly from the corner. Jonah blinked. She? Mira gave a small smile. Yeah. She's a girl. He looked back at the blanket again. Somehow, that changed something. Or maybe it just made it more real. Right, he murmured. Okay. Ellie started scribbling instructions on a clipboard. Her tone returned to clinical. She's going to need a name. The tag system at the pharmacy requires one. Jonah looked at the clipboard. Then at the pup. The room felt smaller suddenly. Warmer. More fragile. I'll think of something, he said. But inside, the beginnings of a name were already forming, drawn from the storm, from the snow, from the way she hadn't given up. He reached out and rested his palm lightly on the mound of blankets, just enough to feel the faint rise and fall of her breathing beneath. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. The pup didn't move, but somehow, in that stillness, it felt like she heard him and chose to stay. The snow hadn't stopped. It whispered down in soft spirals, clinging to the windshield, the side mirrors, the folds of Jonah's jacket as he stepped out of the truck. The crunch beneath his boots echoed into the stillness of the trees. The storm had eased, but the cold hadn't. It gnawed at the skin and the bones beneath, as if to remind him what was real, what was still fragile. He opened the passenger door slowly. The bundle in the ranger jacket barely stirred, but the shallow rise and fall beneath the folds told him she was still breathing, still fighting. Jonah moved carefully, arms cradling the pup, with a gentleness that didn't match the rest of him. This man who wore silence like armor and grief like a scar no one dared name. The snow caught in his stubble, the tip of his nose pink with cold, but his grip never faltered. The cabin stood just ahead, half buried in white, wrapped in the quiet of the wilderness. One porch light flickered a bulb he'd never replaced. The front steps were buried under half a foot of fresh snow. He didn't bother brushing it away, just pushed forward, every footfall heavy, deliberate. The door creaked open with a groan. Inside, the air was still. Cold, a faint smell of cedar and iron. The wood stove in the corner sat cold and blackened. Everything looked just the way he'd left it, sparse, utilitarian, untouched by anything soft. Until now, Jonah walked straight to the old rug near the stove and knelt. He unwrapped the ranger jacket slowly, careful not to jostle the stitched leg or bandaged flank. Beneath the folds, the pupno, the girl, his girl lay curled, breath-light and uneven. Her fur was still matted in places with dried blood, her ear nicked. But there was warmth rising from her chest now. Real, stubborn warmth. He laid her down gently on a folded fleece blanket, grabbed 2 more from the storage chest, and tucked them around her sides. Then he moved to the stove. The flint striker sparked on the 3rd try. Flame caught the kindling with a lazy hiss, then grew as he fed it slivers of pine and a thick log from the stack he kept near the wall. Soon, the orange glow pulsed against the cabin walls, shadows dancing across rough-hewn beams and worn floorboards. He sat back on his heels, staring at the tiny bundle on the rug. The flicker of firelight danced across her fur, catching the faint caramel in her coat, the black that masked her face. She didn't open her eyes, but her ears twitched at the crackle of the flames. That was enough. Jonah leaned against the wall, knees bent, hands dangling between them. He hadn't had another living soul inside this place since he exhaled, long and slow. There was an ache in his chest that felt like recognition, like something dormant was waking up, stretching inside the hollow place where he used to carry purpose. His voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. Looks better with you in it. Oh. The pup didn't stir. Still, he found himself talking. I should warn you, I don't do great with things that need me. I spend too long in the quiet. I leave dishes in the sink. I get up before dawn and forget to eat. The fire popped softly. But I don't give up, he added. Not anymore. He rubbed the back of his neck, then stood and walked to the kitchen. The tea kettle went on the burner. A bowl of warm water and a clean rag followed, set beside her bed. One by one, he dabbed gently at the dried blood around her snout, her paws. She flinched, but didn't resist. You're okay now, he said, barely above a whisper. No one's gonna hurt you here. When he finished, he sat again on the floor beside her, elbows on knees, shoulders curved forward like the weight of the day had finally settled. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, warmth began to take root. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring if she'd take a turn for the worse, if the infection would flare, if he'd be enough to keep her alive. But tonight, she was here, and so was he. For the first time in a long time, that felt like something worth holding on to. The morning broke in shades of gray. Outside the windows, the world was still buried beneath a quilt of snow. Pines drooped under the weight. The wind had quieted, but the cold hadn't left. Frost curled along the glass panes, like veins on old paper. Inside, the fire had burned low, but not out. Jonah stirred it back to life with practiced hands, adding 2 logs with care so the heat wouldn't spike too suddenly. He didn't want to startle her. She lay where he'd left, her blankets curled gently around her sides, breath shallow but present. The bandage on her back leg had stayed in place. The fever hadn't worsened. But the stillness, the complete surrender to gravity still, made his gut tighten. He crouched beside her with a bowl of warm broth, shredded boiled chicken floating in it like little clouds. The smell filled the cabin, light but comforting. He dipped 2 fingers in, letting it drip slowly onto her tongue. For a moment there was no reaction, then her tongue moved. Just once. Then again. Jonah exhaled. His shoulders sagged, just a little. He dipped the spoon again, bringing it closer. She didn't open her eyes, but her snout tilted weakly toward the scent. He tried again, this time with a sliver of chicken between his fingers. Her jaw opened, closed, chewed. "That's it," he whispered. "Easy, girl." He didn't smile, but something flickered in his expression, a softening around the eyes. The kind of look a man wears when something begins to matter again. Despite his best intentions, he fed her slowly, finger by finger, a spoon at a time, until she had taken almost a third of the bowl. Then he set it aside and leaned back against the couch, stretching his legs out toward the fire, letting his hand dangle near her side in case she stirred again. The silence returned, heavy but not hollow. His gaze drifted toward the photograph, still half tucked into the corner of the bookshelf fold and bent, barely visible from where he sat. 2 uniforms, 1 smile, a younger version of himself. That photo hadn't moved in 3 winters. Neither had he, really. Until now. He was about to close his eyes when he felt it just the faintest pressure. Something against his boot. His eyes opened. She had moved. Her nose just barely had nudged the leather of his worn hiking boot. Not a paw, not a bark. Just a soft, uncertain gesture. Like the kind a child makes in the dark, to see if someone's still there. Jonah froze, then looked down. Her head hadn't lifted, but her nose remained pressed against him. "Like trust," whispered in the smallest language. "Like life, refusing to vanish quietly." He didn't speak for a long while, just watched her, listened to the fire crackle, felt the weight of her breath, feather-light as it was, and let the moment carve a crack through the thick, sealed door inside him. It had been years since anything had reached him like that. And this wasn't a rescue anymore. This was the beginning of something else. The third night came colder than the last. Outside, the wind returned with teeth, rattling the edges of the world. Trees swayed like old ghosts trying to speak. Inside the cabin, though, something had changed. Not the temperature, not the silence. Something less obvious, something that pulsed beneath it all like a faint heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Jonah didn't light the lantern right away. He sat in the near dark beside the wood stove, the glow of embers soft against his face. The pup still bandaged, still weak lay curled in a nest of old flannel and wool. Her breath steady, ears twitching at the crackle of fire. Jonah stared at her, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced. There were lines on his face that hadn't always been there, and a stillness in his posture that had taken years to harden. "You know," he muttered finally, voice low and half gravel, "I used to talk to someone every night." The pup didn't stir. "Not out loud," he added. "At first." He rubbed his jaw, eyes flickering toward the photo still tucked into the shelf. The edges were curling now. He'd never had the heart to frame it. Framing something meant it had a place, and he wasn't sure anything had a place anymore. "I used to talk to her, Sam. She'd listen even when I didn't say much. Had that kind of quiet, the kind that fills in the blanks, you know." He exhaled. Bet you don't. The pup gave the faintest grunt. Jonah blinked. You just make that noise to humor me, or... Another grunt. Softer this time. Less like pain. More like breath responding to voice. He tilted his head, watching the little rise and fall of her chest. You've made it farther than anyone thought, he said. Hell, farther than I thought. You're not just tough. You're stubborn. The pup shifted, ears flicking at the timbre of his voice. Jonah leaned back slightly, pulled the flannel tighter around her sides, then sat cross-legged beside her on the cabin floor. There were empty bowls on the counter now, strips of torn cloth beside a makeshift first aid box, a small dent in the cabin's loneliness that hadn't been there days ago. You need a name, he said finally. The room went still again, but not heavy. Jonah searched her face, still marred by the healing scab near her eye, but strong underneath. There was something about her that didn't bend easily. Something old, even if she was young. I was thinking. Lobo, he said. It means wolf. The pup gave a soft exhale. Not quite a whine. Almost a sigh. It fits, Jonah continued. You're not domesticated, not the tail-wagging kind. You're wild. You survived what should have killed you. And something tells me you'll survive a hell of a lot more. He paused, as if tasting the word again. Lobo. The name settled into the cabin like smoke curling from pine wood, gentle but lasting. The pup Lobo stretched one paw forward in her sleep. Just a little. Just enough. Jonah smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. He stayed there for a long while, leaning against the stove, telling stories he hadn't told in years, half to himself, half to her. About mountains, about storms, about a woman with wildfire hair, and a laugh like spring. Lobo didn't move much, but her breathing never faltered. And when Jonah finally leaned back and let his eyes drift shut, the silence didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a bond. A name had been given, and this time it was meant to stay. Morning came pale and soundless, the kind of hush that only fresh snow could bring. Outside the cabin, the world had been buried in white again soft drifts, clinging to the porch rail, sculpting the trees into still sentinels. But inside, the scent of something warm began to rise. Broth, slow, simmered from leftover chicken and bone. Jonah stood at the stovetop, ladling the liquid into a cracked mug. His movements were deliberate, careful not out of fragility, but because care had become a rare ritual in his life. Something earned, something not wasted. Behind him, near the stove, Lobo stirred. She didn't lift her head yet, but her ears twitched at the sound. The fire's warmth had flushed some color back into her cheeks. Her ribs still showed, but the tremble in her limbs had stilled. For the first time, her breathing didn't sound like a countdown. Jonah crouched beside her, holding the mug steady. He let it cool just enough, then dipped his fingers in, bringing the broth to her mouth slowly, steadily, like coaxing a frightened bird. Easy, he murmured. No rush. Lobo sniffed it once, then again, and then gingerly licked. The moment was so small it could have passed for nothing, but Jonah watched her like the world depended on it. Good girl, he whispered. He dipped again. And this time, Lobo licked with more purpose. A tiny swallow. Then, another. Her tail still thin, still matted, gave a faint, almost imperceptible thump against the wool blanket beneath her. Jonah froze. Then only then, he let the smile come. It wasn't wide. It didn't split his face or reach for some performative joy. It was quiet, like the moment itself. The kind of smile that came not from happiness, but from relief. From witnessing something return that he'd thought was gone. The tail thumped again. You're still in there, Jonah said, voice low and even, like he didn't want to scare the moment off. You've still got fight. He fed her a few more sips. When she paused, he waited. When she looked up briefly, weakly he met her eyes. There was no sparkle in them yet, but they weren't hollow either. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient as ever, but the cabin didn't feel buried anymore. It felt like something was thawing. And this time, it wasn't the fire. The fire had burned low, Just embers, now soft orange pulses in a world muffled by snow. The blizzard outside had thinned to a whisper, no longer screaming at the windows, only brushing against the glass like a memory trying to get in. Inside the cabin, it was still. Jonah sat on the old floorboards, back against the log wall, arms resting loosely on bent knees. Across from him, Lobo lay curled on a folded blanket, her breaths shallow but steady, each exhale visible in the dim glow. There was no sound but the fire's breath and their own. No music, no conversation, just the quiet company of two survivors too worn for words. Jonah didn't move, not even when his back began to ache. He watched the fire, listened to the rhythm of her breathing. In a life filled with harsh winds and gunmetal skies, this stillness felt louder than gunfire, more intimate than any confession. A log shifted in the stove, popping softly. Lobo lifted her head. Slowly, uncertainly, she shifted her weight and did something that hit Jonah harder than any roar in the forest. She stretched out her paw and laid it across his shin. Just enough to feel him, just enough to say something. Jonah didn't flinch. He looked down at the soft, worn fur, the half-healed wound barely hidden beneath. His throat closed without warning. There were no tears, not from him. That part of him had frozen over long ago. But the pressure in his chest told him something deeper, a heartbeat responding to another. Lobo didn't look up. She didn't have to. That one gesture held more weight than 1,000 apologies, more than any eulogy, any medal, any meaningless "thank you for your service" said in passing at a grocery store. He didn't speak. He just let her paw rest there, let the heat from the stove blur their silhouettes on the wooden floor. In that moment, there were no pasts between them, no ghosts, no thunderous silence or locked doors or scars too deep to name. There was only this: a man whose world had shrunk to pain, and a dog whose world had been taken by force, and both somehow finding breath beside a fire that neither of them built alone. Jonah reached down, not abruptly, not like he was petting a dog, but gently, reverently, as if afraid the moment might vanish. He placed his hand over her paw. Warmth met warmth. Wounds met wounds. And neither one pulled away. The late afternoon sun was little more than a pale bruise behind silver clouds when Jonah stepped onto the porch, axe balanced across one shoulder. Fresh snow squeaked beneath his boots. His breath hovered like smoke and vanished in the still air. Inside, the fire had done its work heat, soaking into rough log walls and the bones of a dog too thin for winter. But the woodpile beside the stove was down to scraps no thicker than his thumb. If night came hard again, they'd need more than scraps. He crossed the yard, boots punching neat holes in the drift, and set the first round of pine on the chopping block. The axe head glinted, came down with a satisfying crack. Resinous scent lifted into the cold, like a small promise of warmth still to come. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Jonah paused mid-swing, half expecting wind, but then he heard the soft tap of paws. He turned. Lobo stood in the doorway, ribs outlined under the spare blanket Jonah had tucked around her like a makeshift cape. She wobbled once, steadied herself, and stepped down, each paw hesitant in the deep snow. Every movement was a negotiation between pain and stubbornness. "You should be resting," Jonah called, voice softened by something he never used to show. The dog ignored him, nose testing the air, ears twitching at distant hushes in the trees. She took 3 determined steps, then a 4th, and reached his side as he split another log. He laid the axe handle against the block and knelt. "You trying to supervise?" he asked, rubbing behind her uninjured ear. "Because right now you're about as steady as that porch lamp." Lobo's tail gave a slow wagon. 2 thumps against snow, then went still. Her body locked, muscles quivering beneath scarred fur. Nose lifted, drawing the air in sharp, silent breaths. Jonah felt the shift like temperature dropping. He followed her gaze. The shed sat 50 feet away, half swallowed by drift. Its cedar siding, long ago faded to gray, was now gashed. 3 deep furrows raked fresh across the wood, razor clean, edges still weeping sap that shone amber in the weak light. Jonah's blood cooled. He rose slowly, stepping in front of Lobo, as if the gesture could block memory itself. The woods beyond the shed were hushed. Still no wind, no crows, nothing but the faint hiss of falling flakes. Jonah's grip tightened on the axe. The claw marks were higher than his waist, spaced Wydea signature he'd hoped never to read again. The bear hadn't just passed through, it had stopped, tested the boards, carved its warning into the place where Jonah stored feed, tools, and salted venison. It knew where life was now. Beside him, Lobo's ears pinned back. A low rumble caught in her throat. She stepped once into the snow, but her injured leg buckled, forcing her to plant awkwardly. Still, she faced the tree line, eyes locked on shadows. "Easy," Jonah whispered, laying a hand on her shoulder. The tremor under his palm wasn't fear, it was urgency, memory, the animal knowledge that danger had shape and scent. Jonah's gaze swept the perimeter. The thinning pines, the ridge curling east, the half-frozen stream glittering like a knife. No movement, but that meant nothing. A grizzly could blend into twilight as easily as smoke. It could be watching right now, weighing distance, licking hunger from cold teeth. Jonah's mind raced. He could haul Lobo inside, bar the door, stoke the stove until morning, but the bear wasn't probing boards for warmth. It was claiming territory. If it decided the cabin was part of that claim, walls wouldn't matter. His breath crystallized mid-air as he exhaled. Lobo nudged forward again, this time pressing her flank against his boot settle, but there, like earlier, by the fire, only heavier, urgent. "I'm here. I know." Jonah touched the place where her fur met fresh stitches. "Not today, girl," he murmured. "You fought too hard to stand between me and that damn thing again." He scanned the yard once more, heart thudding. Nothing moved yet. The silence felt bruised, as if sound itself were hiding. He could almost hear the bear's last roar reverberating in the grain of the split wood. Jonah forced a breath, hefted the axe and embedded it in the stump with a single decisive strike. The sound cracked across the clearing like a warning shot. "Tomorrow we set lines of bells," he told Lobo, voice steady though his pulse was wild. "We'll move the feed inside, and I'll keep the rifle on the rack by the door. M." Lobo looked up, amber eyes catching the thin light. She didn't understand every word, but she understood resolve. Her tale gave one slow Wagga covenant of shared vigilance. Jonah crouched, lifted her gently into his arms, despite the dull protest in his shoulders. She was heavier than the day he'd carried her out of the snowbank, but still light enough to remind him how close she'd come to disappearing. As he crossed the yard, snow whispered against his boots. The cabin lamp flickered above the door, casting long, wavering shadows that danced ahead of them and man, one dog, and behind them, 3 savage claw marks scarring the shed. A reminder carved in wood, the past doesn't surrender easily. Inside, Jonah eased Lobo onto her blanket beside the stove. The fire greeted them with a low roar as he nudged a new log into place, sparks leaping like startled fireflies. He caught himself listening, really listening, for distant branches breaking, for the low growl of something huge and hungry in the trees. Nothing came. Only the sigh of flame and the soft click of Lobo's claws settling against the floorboards. But the warning remained, etched deep in cedar and deeper in his thoughts. Jonah closed the door, slid the bolt, and rested his forehead against the cool wood for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he turned back to Lobo, who watched him with awake, unwavering eyes. 2 survivors, 1 fire, an outside-the-wall swinter, and a predator that had not forgotten. Jonah bent, laid a steady hand on her neck. "We'll be ready," he said. Lobo's tail tapped the floorone beat, then 2. The fire popped, sending a plume of sparks up the chimney. Night settled around the cabin, thick and silent, but inside the glow held, and in that thin circle of light, man and dog kept watch waiting for whatever the dark would ask of them next. Night pooled thick beyond the windows, an ink-black weight pressing against every pane. Wind worried the eaves, carrying the faint groan of trees flexing under ice. Jonah moved through the cabin like a shadow, with purpose quiet, swift, deliberate, each small sound amplified by the hush outside. He slid the cedar bolt across the front entrance, then wedged a length of oak cut to fit for storms, and worse into iron brackets he'd mounted years ago but never used. Wood met wood with a dull knock that reverberated through the floorboards. Not enough. He crossed to the back door, where cold air seeped under the sill, and drove a heavy deadbolt home until the metal clacked tight. One by one, he lit the mold brass bodies, glass chimneys streaked with soot, and placed them at the cabin's vulnerable seams. The sill facing the tree line, the the corner near the shed side, the narrow loft window above the stairs. Pools of honey-colored light bloomed, pushing back just a sliver of dark. Still, the black beyond the glass felt alive, as if something waited where lantern glow dissolved to nothing. Her injured leg dragged, but determination turned each step into a measured patrol. She sniffed the doorframe, circled the stove, paused at the window where claw marks were memory rather than sight. Ears flicked, tail low, every sense tuned to frequencies Jonah could only imagine. She stopped, hackles rising, and stared at the wall that faced the shed as though she could see straight through timber to the gouges outside. He opened the gun cabinet, a battered pine box, scarred by weather and time, and pulled out the .30-06 he hadn't fired since the season after Sam died. Dust powdered the barrel. He lifted a rag, wiped once, then set a single box of rounds on the table. His fingers trembled when he slid cartridges into the magazine, not because of cold or age, but because memory knuckled hard between his ribs. A bear's roar splitting frozen air, a puppy's body flying like tossed rag, blood hissing on snow. He worked the bolt, chambered around, checked the safety twice out of habit formed when mistakes cost lives. For a beat, he simply held the rifle, stock pressed to his shoulder, cheek against the worn walnut, eye on nothing but dark glass. Muscle remembered recoil, ears remembered how silence shattered. A low growl rumbled from Lobo's chest. Jonah lowered the rifle. "I hear it too," he muttered. He knelt beside her, running a palm down her spine, feeling tension coiled beneath patchy fur. A living wire stretched too tight. Her body quivered, not in pain this time, but in warning, the quake of an instinct older than domestication. She pressed her nose against the barrel, as if recognizing the tool that had saved her life once already. "Yeah," Jonah whispered, voice rough. "Old friends back on duty." He rose, set the rifle against the wall within arm's reach, then fetched a coil of thin galvanized wire, sleigh bells strung like tin hearts along its length. Out the front door, just for seconds, she stapled the bell line across the porch rail and back, so any weight heavier than fox or pine marten would jangle a cold alarm into the night. Each hammer strike echoed off trees, then dissolved into hush. Inside again, he tied a second string of bells to the metal-grained bucket and set it against the shed-facing wall tripwire for claws, too curious. The cold from his coat seeped through flannel, but sweat dampened his collar. When all was secure, he turned down the lantern wicks to half light enough to see sights, not enough to glare on windows. He stoked the stove, shut its iron door, then finally allowed himself to sit on the floor beside Lobo. She settled, but did not lie down. She faced the door, muscles coiled like a bow waiting for draw. Jonah rested a hand atop her head. The tremor there mirrored the tremor in his own arm. "Not fear," he told her, though half to himself, "just knowing what's coming." Oh. Beyond timber and glass, the forest exhaled. Snow slid from a bowed limb with a hush-like breath through teeth. Somewhere deeper, a single branch cracked sharp, sudden, then nothing. No jingle of bells yet, but Jonah's heart kicked once against his ribs. He eased the safety off with a soft click. Lobo's ears rotated toward the sound outside, eyes narrowing tonight. Two survivors, one rifle, a thinning line of lantern glow, and the vast unknown stalking just beyond it, heavy with the scent of claws and unfinished business. They waited, and the dark listened back. Midnight crawled over the Bitterroot like a slow-moving eclipse, blotting stars and squeezing every glimmer of warmth from the snow-packed forest. Inside the cabin, lantern light had thinned to dull halos, and the stove ticked as it cooled, metal contracting with tiny, nervous pingses, if the iron itself sensed what lingered beyond the walls. Jonah sat cross-legged on the floor, rifle across his thighs, thumb idling over the safety switch. He had not dozed, not even blink-slept. Instead, he listened, counting heartbeats between the faint creaks of settling timber. Lobo lay at his side, head up, ears angled toward the door like living antennae. Her breathing was low, measured, but the tremor beneath her ribs told him she too was tracking every stray sound. The clock on the mantel clicked over to 12:17 a.m. Jonah's pulse answered the minute hand. Outside, wind slid through branches, carrying a hush so absolute it felt deliberating an entire wilderness holding breath, waiting for the next move. Then the silence fractured. A limb somewhere beyond the porch snapped under tremendous weight, no whip of wind, no scatter of smaller twigs. One clean break, deep and resonant, like a bone giving up. The jingle wire across the rail stayed mute, but Jonah's spine stiffened as if the sound had come from inches away. Lobo rose in a single, fluid mociono wobble now. No hint of healing weakness, just primal certainty. She padded to the door, tail low, head forward, body frozen in perfect point. A low growl rolled from her chest, vibrated through the floorboards, and died in Jonah's boots. He lifted the rifle, settled the butt against his shoulder, muzzle angled toward the center of the door. The lantern's small flame caught the barrel, glinting like a blade edge. His sight picture steadied on nothing, yet felt too necessary to lower. Another sound softer, but closer. The subtle scuff of snow displaced by something massive and deliberate. Still no bell jangle. The bear was skirting the perimeter, smarter this time, avoiding the porch where Tin Hearts waited to proclaim its arrival. Jonah's breath slowed, stretched between seconds. He felt Lobo press against his calf. No bark, just silent contact, a reminder that 2 heartbeats steadied the cabin now. He laid his free hand on her shoulders, felt the tremble there, answered with his own stillness. Outside, everything went quiet again, but not the natural hush of falling snow. This was that graveyard silence he remembered from patrols overseas, the moment just after a hidden tripwire broke, right before the world exploded. It was the silence of something judging distance, tasting fear in the air. Jonah's vision tunneled on the door latch, every nerve expecting it to rattle. Sweat cooled at the base of his neck despite the chill. He counted breath shiz. Lobo Sand waited for the hammer to fall. A low, guttural huff drifted from the darkness beyond the shuttered window. Not a roar. A statement. I'm here. Lobo's lips peeled back, but she did not make a sound beyond that growl instinct telling her voice would only feed the beast. Jonah tightened his grip on the rifle. He thought of flare guns, of warning shots into night, then dismissed the idea. A misplaced flash might spook the bear into frenzy instead of retreat. Worse, it could blind him to movement. Snow slid off the roof with a soft whomp, dusting the porch boards. Jonah's pulse hammered. Lobo's claws scraped a half-inch on the floor. Still, the door held. Minutes passed hard, grinding minutes where a single heartbeat felt too loud. Lantern flame fluttered, throwing shadows that leapt on log walls like specters. Jonah exhaled through his teeth. Steady, slow, the way he once did when the wrong step could light a mine. Different soil, same consequence. Another branch snapped farther off now, deeper into the tree line. A second huff, fading. Then, nothing but wind again, brushing past the cabin with disinterested fingers. Jonah dared one step to the window, Lobo ghosting him. He peered past the curtain's edge, just snow, blur, and pine silhouettes swaying under clouded moonlight. No monstro's shape, no ember eyes-catching lantern glow. But fresh tracks scarred the drifts beyond the shed-wide depressions, toe-dragged ruts already dusted with falling flakes. The bear had come close, close enough to taste wood and iron, close enough to measure the distance between predator and firelit prey and retreat, for now, into the ink. Jonah lowered the curtain, turned back to the room. His shoulders sagged, but only an inch. Tension still crackled through his muscles like static kneading ground. Lobo sat where he'd left her, watching him, breathing hard but silent. He knelt, pressed his forehead to hers. "Not tonight," he whispered. The words shook, more relief than triumph. "We hold line tonight." Lobo's tail nudged once against the floor. Jonah eased the rifle safety back on, set it within reach of his bedroll. He did not lay down. Sleep felt like an invitation the dark might accept. He stoked the stove again, just enough to keep coals glowing, then settled beside Lobo, with his back against the wall. The cabin was silent once more, but it was the earned silence of 2 sentinels and a fire still burning. Beyond the lanterns, the wilderness regrouped under moon-shrouded clouds, preparing whatever test would come next. Inside, man and dog waited, breathing in tandem, no words, no music, only the steady echo of each other's hearts, refusing to be the first to falter. The lantern wick burned low, no taller than a match, head casting a thin, amber veil across log walls, now hushed and waiting. Snow ticked against the windows in slow, restless drifts, like fingers drumming a warning neither occupant intended to answer. Outside, the bear's heavy presence had receded into pin-drop quiet. Inside, tension lingered, humming in the gaps between crackling embers. Jonah kniet beside Lobo. The rifle lay within arm's reach, bolt locked, muzzle angled at the door. But steel felt suddenly less certain than the warm pulse beneath his fingertips. He spread his hand over the ridgeline of her spine-wiry fur, healed scabs, rib bones beneath and pressed gently, not to comfort her, but to anchor himself. No words passed. They weren't necessary. Lobo settled under his palm, muscles uncoiling one at a time. The tremor that had ridden her frame all night eased, though it never fully vanished. Instinct wouldn't let it. Her ears flicked toward each gust outside, yet her eyes stayed on Jonah Deep Amber, widening with a quiet surety he'd never found in mirrors or metals. Wind rattled the stovepipe. The lantern glass chimed. Jonah's thumb traced slow arcs across Lobo's coat, mapping every scar, every stitch Ellie had woven to keep her breathing. He'd memorized those scars as surely as the claw gouges on the shed, both sets of marks telling the same story. We survived, but we were changed. He inhaled, let the air fill places he'd kept empty for years. Exhaled, in the hush, their two breaths overlapped his broader, hers shallow yet stubborn, knitting a cadence older than language. Whatever comes through those trees, he thought, turning the words over like stones in the dark, it won't find us alone. He tightened his grip, just enough for Lobo to feel the promise settle into bone. She leaned into the pressure fraction of an inch harder, tail brushing his boot in a silent reply. Agreed. Minutes pooled into an hour. The clock ticked past 1:30. The bear did not return, but the forest remained too quiet, holding its cards close. Jonah kept vigil, palm never leaving Lobo's back. Lantern oil dwindled. Orange glow shrank to a halo no larger than the breadth of his forearm. Yet even as light thinned, their outline, man and dog, fused by touch, grew more solid than fear. He remembered nights on distant ridges, alone with a radio that crackled out of range, pressing a hand over his own chest just to feel motion under Kevlar. Back then, silence meant danger had moved on. Now, it meant danger was thinking, measuring. And he too was measuring. Rounds left in the box, distance to the truck, strength in a rebuilt leg that might need to run again. But the math kept returning to the same answer here. This cabin, this fragile circle of lamplight, this heart beneath his hand. Leaving wasn't an option. Surrender, even less. He let his eyes close for 3 breaths, no more, absorbing the warmth seeping up from Lobo's body into his calloused skin. When he opened them again, dawn had not yet creased the sky, but color was changing at the edge of the window pane. Black to charcoal, charcoal to the faintest slate. A fresh gust pushed through the pines outside. Somewhere far off, an owl called twice and quit the woods, releasing sound, testing if night was willing to depart. Jonah's hand remained. Not much longer, he murmured, voice more gravel than sound. Light will come. Lobo's ears rotated toward his whisper acknowledgement without movement. The fire popped once, sparks spiraling up the chimney. Jonah fed it a single stick, enough to keep coals breathing until dawn finished the job. Then he sank back onto his heels, maintaining contact. Fingers splayed, heartbeat steadied. He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to imprint the texture of this vow. Wood smoke, dog breath, pulse meeting pulse. A pact sealed not in blood or bullets, but in the simple truth of 2 lives that refused to be sundered. Outside, the first pale thread of morning unspooled through branches. Inside, his hand never moved. And in that steadfast touch, fear found no purchase, only a promise stronger than winter and claws combined. False dawn hovered over the ridgeline, painting the timber in bruised indigo. A hush clung to the forest, brittle as rime on pine needle stew, still for birdsong, too tense for sleep. Inside the cabin, Jonah's eyelids fluttered but never shut. He sat propped against the wall, rifle resting across folded knees, hand still anchored to the warm rise and fall of Lobo's ribs. A single bell jangled outside, one sharp, startled chime that shattered the quiet. Jonah's eyes snapped wide. Lobo's head lifted, ears spearing the dark. Before Jonah could rise, sound erupted beyond the back wall. Wood splintering, metal buckling, the deep timbre of something heavy driving forward without hesitation. Crack boom. The rear shed caved inward like rotten fruit, struck by a fist. Boards screamed. Hinges tore free. A roar followed, draw, guttural, vibrating through soil and marrow, the voice of muscle, hunger, and unfinished business. Jonah surged to his feet. The rifle came up. Safety flicked off with practiced muscle memory. Lantern light quivered across the walls. And then, in the heartbeat between decision and recoil, Lobo moved first. She shot past his shins, no limp, no hesitation, just a streak of sable and scar dogging the line between instinct and sacrifice. Jonah's mouth formed her name, but the syllables strangled in his throat as the cabin door flew open beneath Lobo's momentum, banging back against the jamb. Cold rushed in, carrying sawdust, the stench of fresh sap, the metallic bite of fear. Jonah lunged after her, boots grinding against planks, slick with frost. Outside, the world was chaos. Shed roof peeled aside like paper, seed sacks scattered across drifts, sawdust spinning in morning gloom. Amid the wreckage loomed the bear monolithic, shoulders bunched, fur dusted with shards of cedar. It turned at Lobo's charge, small eyes glinting ember red in lantern spill. For a second, predator and pup froze in tableau, the bear's hot breath ghosting the air. Lobo's hackles flared despite the bandaged leg, both reading distance, intent, inevitability. Jonah's pulse slammed so hard he felt it in his teeth. He leveled the rifle. In the icy hush between heartbeats, the world narrowed to iron sights and a patch of thick fur behind the beast's foreleg. He could end Itone's squeeze. One thunderclap, yet the shot would explode beside Lobo, concussive wave enough to throw her broken body back into snow. Too close, too risky. Then, the bear lunged. It came on with earth-shaking force, claws shredding through drift. Lobo darted left, sacrificing speed for precision, baiting the beast away from the cabin's wall. She skidded, paws scrabbling, wound screaming beneath skin. Jonah saw it in the falter of her step, but still she held the line, barking once, sharp, drawing fury to herself. Time fractured. Jonah swung right, sidestepped the chaos for an angle clear of Lobo. The bear reared, front paw arcing down a slab of muscle and talon aimed to crush. Snow erupted where Lobo had been. She rolled, half leapt, came up limping yet defiant, eyes burning gold against morning slate. Jonah found his window. Exhale. Trigger. Detonation. The rifle cracked like splitting ice. Muzzle flash scorched dawn. The round slammed into the bear's shoulder. A tuft of fur burst, blood spattered red on white snow. The beast recoiled, roaring pain into treetops. But wounded wasn't beaten it, hurtled again at the smaller threat, still dancing before its reach. "Lobo, down!" Jonah roared, chambering another round. Whether she heard or understood, Jonah never knew. What he saw was momentum shift bear twisting, weight thrown sideways, and Lobo collapsing beneath a swing meant to kill. She disappeared in a plume of powder. Something inside Jonah tore loose, fear jagged and bright. He fired again, center mass this time. The slug punched through ribs. The bear staggered, breath wheezing crimson mist. It spun, confused, rage eroding into instinctual retreat. One stumbling step. Another. Then it lumbered toward the tree line, crashing through underbrush with the desperate cadence of a body answering survival over conquest. Silence afterward felt wrong, like breath withheld. Jonah sprinted snow up to calves, rifle forgotten in the drift. He found Lobo half buried, paws digging for traction. Blood stained fresh snow near her flank, but her eyes were clear, bright with refusal. She tried to stand. He stopped her with gentle strength, cradling her chest, searching for mortal wounds. Only torn stitches, oozing red, and the tremor of pain. "Easy, wolf girl," he murmured, voice shaking as his arms had during the reload. "It's gone." She licked his glove, breath hitching, tail brushed snow one beat, brave and battered. Jonah pressed his forehead to hers, heartbeat drumming against skull. Over his shoulder, the pale horizon blushed pink gold, bleeding through treetops like promise. Shedboards hung skewed, bells still silent on the porch. Powder settling over dark blood trails a battlefield frozen in dawn's first glare. But they were alive, both of them. He gathered Lobo into his arm sheavier than the first night, heavier with purpose, and carried her toward the cabin. Wood smoke slipped from the chimney, thin and silver, drawing them home. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the wounded bear bawled once into the waking forest, a sound that dwindled with distance half warning, half surrender. Jonah didn't look back. Inside the doorway, he paused, meeting Lobo's gaze. No need for speech. Breath and pain and stubborn life said enough. He stepped across the threshold, boots dripping crimson-flecked snow, and kicked the door shut on the dawn, the bear, the shed. What remained between these walls was a vow sealed in blood, gunfire, and a pup's impossible courage. Whatever storms the wilderness hurled next, they would not meet them alone. Snow flurried in frantic spirals, stirred by the retreating bear's fury. The shattered shed groaned behind Jonah like a wounded thing. Cedar splinters still hung in the air. He'd managed 2 steps toward the cabin. Lobo cradled tight when a guttural bellow rolled back through the trees closer than it should have been. Jonah wheeled. Through the swirling powder he saw it. The bear, staggering but turning eyes ablaze with a predator's last reckless resolve. Blood sheeted down its shoulder, steaming in the dawn light. Pain hadn't broken it. It had made a decision instead. If this valley would take its life, it would take something in return. Jonah's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. With Lobo in his arms, he had no clean aim, no time to reach the rifle now half buried near the stump. And the beast was already barreling forward, snow exploding beneath each thunderous stride. Not again, Jonah hissed, dropping to one knee to lower Lobo onto her blanket of drifts. Stay. But the instant her paws touched snow, she lurched upright, bandaged hind leg, quivering, ears flat, head low. She placed herself between Jonah and the charging mass without hesitation, as if pain were an afterthought, as if instinct outweighed injury. Lobo, no! Jonah's shout died under the bear's roar. 15 yards. 10. Jonah lunged sideways, scrambling for the rifle still meters away, boots sliding on crimson-flecked ice. A flash of motion drew his eye. Lobo launched forward, all taut muscle and defiance, mouth bared in a snarl that cut through the frigid air like broken glass. She was small against that avalanche of fur, but she didn't yield. She darted left, snapping at the bear's wounded shoulder. Teeth found raw flesh. The beast howled, paw lashing out in a wide, brutal arc. It connected. Lobo flew. Her body hit a snowbank with a dull thud, carving a trench before collapsing in a tangle of limbs. Jonah's breath ripped from his lungs, rage and terror fused. He dove, fingers closing around the rifle's sling. The bear pivoted to Jonah now, hunger and hurt blazing in its eyes, but a hoarse, piercing bark split the dawn. Lobo dragged herself up, staggering, blood blossoming anew where stitches tore. She planted all 4 paw-sewn buckling. Instantly, righted Dan barked again, louder, throat raw, chest heaving, a challenge none could mistake. The bear hesitated not from fear, but confusion. Prey should cower, not stand taller when broken. That half-second was all Jonah needed. He brought the stock tight to his shoulder, sighting down the scarred barrel. Crosshairs settled behind the creature's ear. Lobo's bark thundered a 3rd time, as if willing the shot. Jonah squeezed. Recoil punched, echoed, vanished. The round struck true. A bloom of dark surged across thick fur. The bear staggered, legs folding beneath impossible weight, breath leaving in a shuddering groan. It collapsed into the churned snow, eyes glazing. Still at last, silence crashed down, brutal in its suddenness, broken only by Jonah's ragged breathing and Lobo's strained panting. Rifle still raised, he approached the fallen titan, barrel fixed, until every muscle confirmed death's final claim. Then he let the weapon sag, knees buckling beside Lobo. She stood barely, head drooping, yet eyes burning with something fierce and bright. Blood seeped from reopened wounds, staining white drifts crimson. Jonah slid the rifle aside and gathered her once more, heedless of the slick warmth soaking his coat. "You crazy, beautiful thing," he whispered, voice shaking. "You gave me the shot." Lobo's tail moved, infinitesimal, but enough. He carried her back toward the cabin, every footstep a vow etched into snow. At the porch he paused, glancing over his shoulder at the hulking shape cooling beneath wan sunrise. One more ghost laid down. One more threat silenced. Inside, the lantern still flickered. Stubborn flame, mirroring the stubborn pulse against Jonah's chest. He laid Lobo near the stove, hands working fast fresh gauze, distilled water, antiseptic that stung, but she didn't flinch. Through it all, her gaze never left him, ears relaxing only when his palm found the familiar place atop her head. Rest, he breathed, smoothing fur sticky with fear and loyalty. "Job's done. Outside the world exhaled with him, the pines settling, distant crows calling cautious witness. Snow kept falling, gentle now, as if the storm itself had chosen to bury the past under new, untrodden white. Yet beneath the cabin roof, two survivors knew the truth. Nothing about this wilderness was finished, but together they'd drawn a line and dared the dark to cross it, and when it had, one wounded pup had leapt first. Unafraid, Jonah sat beside Lobo, until her trembling eased, until his own pulse slowed to match hers. Only then did he allow his eyes to close, hand still resting on her shoulder, a silent promise forged in gunfire and roaring dawn. Whatever comes, we rise again and again together. The clearing rang with a metallic scent of fear and pine sap. Splinters from the smashed shed glimmered like frost in the half-light, and breath smoked from every mouthman, dog, beast caught in the razor-thin moment before violence hardened into no return. Jonah's cheek pressed to the rifle's stock, finger barely brushing the trigger. One decisive squeeze could finish what the night had begun, could drop a living mountain of fur and muscle before Lobo's battered legs gave way for good. In his periphery, he felt her presence, chest heaving, stance quivering but unbroken, the small wolf heart refusing to yield. The bear loomed less than 30 feet away, wounded shoulder, matted with dark blood, yet rage eclipsed pain. Eyes like coals snapped from Lobo to Jonah, weighing which heartbeat to silence first. A single step forward caved new snow, a thunderous declaration that terror was not yet sated. Jonah exhaled, not the breath of a hunter, certain of kill, the breath of a man, recalling every unintended cost of a bullet, sent too late, too soon. He shifted the barrel skyward. Boom! The warning shot cracked open dawn. Sound ricocheted through the trees, avalanching down the ridge, startling crows from iced branches. Smoke curled from the muzzle. The rifle kicked against Jonah's shoulder, bruising bone. The concussion rolled over the clearing and evaporated into shivering silence. All three lives halted mid-heartbeat. Lobo's growl cut off, lips frozen over teeth. Snowflakes seemed to hang motionless in the air, each one glittering like the shard of a shattered clock. The bear reared, ears flattening at the gun's thunder, nostrils flaring wide. For a heartbeat Toot stared at Jonah, at Lobo, at the rifle barrel still drifting like a compass needle between heaven and earth. Jonah's arms shook not from recoil, not from fear, but from the weight of every choice carved into that trigger pull. He held the rifle vertical, barrel smoking, eyes locked on the animal's. "Go," the gesture said. "Take what's left of the wilderness and leave this patch of hope unbroken." The bear dropped to all fours, sides heaving. Snow sifted off its back. The low rumble in its throat slipped into something less certain pain, maybe, or the dawning sense that these two shapes before it would not break as easily as their shed walls. It pivoted one massive shoulder slow, deliberate, then another. Each step back seemed to redraw boundary lines in the drifts until the beast stood on the verge of the trees, framed by trunks and dawn haze. There, it paused. A long breath fumed from its muzzle, ghostly, in the cold. Jonah dared not lower the rifle. Lobo dared not relent her stance. Finally, as if the forest itself had exhaled permission, the bear turned fully and disappeared into the pine's branches, snapping in its wake, then settling, then still. Silence swallowed the clearing. Jonah's muscles unclenched all at once. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers, thunking softly into snow. His knees followed, folding under him with no ceremony. He dropped beside Lobo, arms circling her trembling frame as though she might vanish if not physically held to this fragile earth. Her head pressed into his chest. He felt the erratic stutter of her heartbeat against his ribs, too fast, too strong, a metronome of survival. His own pulse answered, ragged and insistent. "I've got you," he rasped, voice torn raw by wind and adrenaline. "It's over." Lobo's tail fluttered, once half a wag, half a release of tension before collapsing. She leaned heavier into him. Strength bled out on snow-stained pink by reopened stitches. Jonah's hands, so steady moments ago, shook uncontrollably as they stroked damp fur, checking for new wounds, finding old ones weeping. Behind them, the cabin's porch lamp flickered in the blue dawn. The shed creaked like a shipwreck settling. Above, dull gray sky brightened by slow degrees, promising cold, but, for the moment, no further trial. Jonah kissed the top of Lobo's head salt and ashen blood. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were hers, his, or meant for some quiet corner of the universe that still allowed miracles to stand their ground. Snow hissed around them, soft as a lullaby, and for the first time since the puppy's cry had pierced a frozen forest, the man let gravity have him collapsing not in defeat, but in sheer, exhausted gratitude, holding the dog who had chosen him as fiercely as he now chose her, while the echo of a single shot drifted into memory and melted with the falling snow. Snowflakes drifted through the settling silence, lazily spiraling over the torn-up clearing where shed boards and bare prints told the story of a night too long for memory. Pale sun crept over the ridge, but its light felt hollow, more reflection than warmth. Jonah stayed on his knees beside Lobo until the last echo of the shot faded from his bloodstream, until he could trust his hands again. She sagged against him, spent. Blood from torn stitches clotted dark against bandages, turning gauze to iron-red lace. Every breath she drew hitched with exhaustion. Every exhale trembled, but still it came proof of a heart too stubborn to quit. Jonah eased a palm under her rib cage, feeling the flutter there like a candle guttering yet refusing to die. "Time to go home," he murmured. The ranger jacket lay half buried in churned snow, sleeves stiff with dried blood hers. His, the bear's. He couldn't tell anymore. He tugged it free, shook off ice, and unfurled it with the gentleness of unfolding old letters. The fabric cracked like parchment. Memories of the first night, the frantic drive, the flatline, the desperate whisper of "I've got you" rose from every crease. He laid the jacket across Lobo's back, scooping her forelegs into the crook of his arm, sliding the coat beneath her belly. She gave a low, tired whine, but didn't flinch. The moment she felt the familiar weight around her, some of the tremor eased as though the cloth itself carried promises stitched into every thread. Jonah cinched the jacket tight and lifted. Pain lanced across his shoulders. Adrenaline had masked fatigue until now. But he gathered her anyway, cradling 30-odd pounds of raw willpower and trust against his chest. Her head lolled near the hollow of his throat. Warm breath fogged the fabric of his flannel shirt. "I've got you," he whispered, words cracking yet certain. Again. Footing was treacherous. Snow churned to slush where the bear had turned, splinters littering the path. But Jonah moved with care, sharpened by purpose. He skirted the bloody furrow where the animal's final stumble had carved a crimson line, crossed the threshold of the porch, and nudged the door wider with a boot. Inside, the lantern on the table had burned nearly dry, its flame a quivering wick of gold. The stove still breathed, but barely. Warmth had faltered during the fight. Jonah bent to stir the embers, feeding in 2 split logs with awkward single-handed motions. Flames licked up at once, throwing copper light across the room. He cleared a space near the hearth blankets, fresh towels, the shallow metal basin already half filled with warmed water. Gently, he laid Lobo down. She whimpered, legs twitching as muscles tried and failed to find comfort. Jonah stripped off his gloves, rinsed bloodstains from his hands, and began cutting through the old bandage with trauma shears. Crimson seeped anew around frayed sutures. He worked fast but mindful, channeling every field dressing he'd ever done on humans into canine anatomyrogate, compress, suture again. His fingers shook only once when he realized the wound at her flank had reopened its full length. The memory of claws raking flesh flashed hot. He clenched his jaw, refocused, and threaded needle through torn skin with silent apologies each time she shivered. Minutes dragged like hours until fresh gauze lay snug, white against dark fur. Lobo's eyes half-opened elated slits of amber tracking him. He touched her muzzle, felt the slick of warm breath. "You're safe." The words filled the room differently than beforeless. A plea, more a statement earned in blood and gunpowder. Behind him, the kettle began to hum. He poured tepid water into a bowl, added a pinch of salt. Ellie insisted prevented dehydration, and offered it. Lobo lapped once, twice, then let her head rest. Good enough for now. Jonah sat back, exhaustion flooding in once purpose receded. His gaze swept the cabin. Lantern dying, shed half gone, ammo box nearly empty. And yet, Something inside him felt steadier than it had in years, like each threat faced and survived had hammered soft metal into tempered steel. He tugged the jacket over her a little tighter, tucking edges beneath her belly. Dried blood crackled. New blood seeped, but slowed. The coat smelled of pine smoke, gun oil, and nights neither of them would forget. It was armor, memory, and vow. A gust rattled the shutters, but no shape lurked beyond the glass. The bear's absence felt real. Nowit's roar faded to ghost echo in the timber. Jonah ran a hand through his hair, sweat cooling to ice at his temples, and let himself sink beside Lobo, spine against the logs. Snow kept falling beyond the eaves, gentler now, as if the sky itself were breathing easier. Jonah closed his eyes for the space of 5 heartbeats, then opened them again. He couldn't sleep yet. Too much to fortify, too much to guard. But for this brief slice of dawn, he allowed gratitude to settle alongside vigilance. He reached out, resting 2 fingers against Lobo's paw. She flexed toes around them, a reflex or a reply, it didn't matter which. Contact was enough. Outside, light climbed higher, painting the valley in faint gold and shades of promise. Inside, a dog and a man counted breaths, in tandem, each inhale a second rescue, each exhale a tacit pledge. We endure. Jonah stared into the fire until shapes blurred, and the echo of his whispered words, I've got you, faded into the soft crackle of wood and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, refusing to quit. Snow muffled the world outside the cabin, laying down a hush so deep it felt like the valley itself was holding its breath. No growl reverberated across the ridgeline. No splinter of cedar snapped in warning, only the soft hiss of flakes against the window panes and the slow, metronomic pulse of 2 lives refusing to flicker out. Jonah had darkened every lantern but one. Its stubby candle sat in a chipped enamel dish on the floorboards, flame bending whenever the stove exhaled. Shadows fluttered across log walls and settled again, like tired birds. The day's first light never truly reached inside. Instead, the room glowed amber, intimate, pared back to essentials, warmth, breath, and the movements of careful hands. Lobo lay on a folded wool blanket in front of the stove, body curled toward the heat. The ranger jacket still cloaked her ribs, but Jonah had peeled it back enough to redress wounds under the flicker of candlelight. Gauze strips, needle and suture thread, a pot of warm salt water, an improvised field hospital that smelled of pine smoke and iron. He knelt beside her, shoulders bowed, fingers steady despite the tremor of exhaustion running along his arms. Every time the needle pierced battered skin, he murmured a soundless apology, lips moving but voice never quite leaving. Words felt too sharp for a silence this fragile. The only language that mattered was touch. Keep pressure here. Dab there. Tie off, steady breathe. Outside, wind nudged loose flakes from the chimney cap. They pattered like timid knocks, as if winter itself were checking to see whether it was still welcome. Jonah dipped fresh gauze into salt water and pressed it against the jagged tear at Lobo's flank. She twitched but did not pull away. Her eyes-lidded amber dark tracked him, soft in trust. Jonah exhaled through his nose, a breath that rattled on the way out. No sentence could explain what had just blurred past them in claws and gunfire. There was only the echo of adrenaline subsiding, the whisper of their heartbeats returning to mortal tempo. He stroked behind Lobo's ear with his free hand, feeling heat radiate through bandages and singed fur. The candle popped. Wax spilled in a slow rivulet down the dish, pooling like cooling blood. Jonah set the used gauze aside, reached for antiseptic, then paused. The cabin was so quiet he could hear Lobo's whiskers twitch against blanket fibers. He could hear the faint glug of sap settling inside split logs on the hearth. Each sound layered atop the other until silence itself felt orchestral. He listened, and for a moment allowed that quiet to name everything words couldn't. Gratitude, grief, terror finally uncoiling. Snow, breath, survival etched in the rhythm between. A log in the stove shifted, collapsing inward. Flames brightened, illuminating Lobo's face. Jonah found new sutures glinting there, tiny silver knots catching the light. Evidence of battle and of care. He drew the jacket back over her, smoothing it beneath her belly, then tucked the blanket up to her chin. Only her nose peeked out, steamed by each exhale. Her tail made one slow sweep across the floor. I feel you, Jonah eased onto the floor beside her, back against the warm cast iron of the stove. The heat seeped through flannel into aching muscles. He rested his forearm lightly over Lobo's shoulders. No weight, just contact, and closed his eyes. The cabin's single candle guttered, recovered. On the table, an untouched mug of coffee cooled toward bitterness. Beside it lay the rifle he oiled, reloaded, silent now beneath the dim glow. Through the window, dawn bruised the horizon a paler blue, promising nothing more than another day to outlast. Jonah tipped his head against the stovepipe, feeling pulse and pain settle into a lull. He let the silence say what no sentence could bear. We made it through, and we're not alone. The night had tried to unhouse the fragile thing they'd built between them. Daylight found it still breathing. Lobo's ribs lifted under his arm, fell. On the next breath, she nudged her muzzle to his wrist and left it there. Jonah opened his eyes. Candlelight danced in hers like distant campfires. He gave one small nod, the only reply necessary. Outside, flakes kept falling, erasing tracks, softening shattered edges, handing them a clean page neither could yet read. And inside, man and dog clung to the single truth silence had spelled out in blood and snow. Together, they still existed. And sometimes, existence itself was all the language the heart required. Snowlight filtered through the cabin window in thin pearlescent bars, dusting everything with the quiet of a cathedral after candles burn out. The stove ticked softly beside Jonah's shoulder. The single candle on the floor had guttered to a faint ember of wick, but the room still glowed with ember, warmth, and shadows that breathed and settled. Lobo lay wrapped in the ranger jacket, chin resting on the folded blanket. Hours had slipped by in fits of shivering sleep and half-dreams. Each breath measured across Jonah's palm as he checked her warmth. But now, in the hush that comes just after dawn tips fully into day, something shifted. The silence felt less fragile, more alertive in a way it hadn't been since the first night he found her. Jonah sat cross-legged, back against the wall, eyes half closed in exhaustion. He sensed the change before he saw it, the weight of a gaze on his skin, like a soft nudge in a crowded room. He opened his eyes. Lobo was staring at him, not groggy, not dazed, awake, present, amber irises steady and clear as if the night's violence had burned away every fog between them. Her ears twitched at his small intake of breath, but she didn't flinch, didn't drift. She watched him, unblinking. Jonas Pulse stumbled. "Hey, girl," he whispered, voice scraped raw from hours of vigilance. He waited for the heavy drift back into unconsciousness that often followed her brief, wakeful blinks. It didn't come. Instead, she shifted only a fraction, careful of stitches bringing her nose inches closer to his knee. Her tail didn't wag. Her body held still, conserving what strength remained. But the intent in her gaze felt louder than any bark. "I'm here. With you." Jonah swallowed against an ache rising from somewhere far older than this cabin. "You're still fighting," he murmured, as if speaking might fracture the moment. "You stubborn wolf." Her eyes flicked to the stove, then back to him, as though tracing the circle of warmth that held them both. No plea, no fear, only question, now what? Jonah exhaled a breath that trembled on the way out. He set a hand lightly atop her neck, no pressure, just the connection they'd used all night as communion. Heat radiated through bandages, through the jacket, into his calloused palm, and something deep inside him long iced over began to melt too fast to control. He tried for steadiness, but the dam broke anyway. Tears arrived without warning, hot, unwanted, unstoppable. They blurred the cabin, blurred Lobo's face, blurred the safe ring of firelight into smeared gold and shadow. He hadn't cried on the night Sam died, nor when the casualty report stamped final across the only future he'd believed in. He'd swallowed grief the way a soldier swallows grit until bitterness lined every word he didn't say. Now a dog's steadfast gaze cracked him open. Jonah pressed the heel of one hand hard against his eyelids, but that only made the sob crawl up his throat, half moan, half prayer. He turned his face toward the rafters, breathed like a man surfacing from a long-held dive, lungs burning with the shock of oxygen. "I'm sorry," he choked, word meant for the universe, for himself, for anyone who once believed he couldn't feel. "I'm sorry it took so damn long." Lobo's ears perked, head tilting at the fractured sound. She pushed her muzzle forward, nudging his shin. He dropped his hand, let her touch ground him, and found her eyes again still on him, still bright with that patient, knowing light. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement. A paw in snow that had saved him from the abyss. He wiped his face on his sleeve, laughter hitching through tears. "Look at me," he muttered, shaking his head. Big bad ranger crying over a pup he barely knows. But that wasn't truth anymore. He knew her, knew the pitch of her warning, growl, the cadence of her paw against pine floor, the way she planted herself between him and death as though her own heartbeat were expendable if it bought him one more second. She had become the compass needle pointing him back to parts of himself he'd buried beneath frost and silence. Jonah leaned forward, forehead touching hers. "Thank you," he whispered into warm fur that smelled of antiseptic and smoke. "For staying." A slow blink, answered soft, unhurried. A promise echoed back without a sound. Outside, snow eased to a flurry, so light it looked like swirling dust in the dawn glow. The valley held its breath, but the hush was different, now expectant rather than fearful. Jonah drew back, composed himself, and poured fresh water into the tin bowl, thinning it with the last of the warm broth. He slid it under Lobo's jaw. She sniffed, lapped weakly, then settled her head again, eyes still open, still on him. He smiled through red-rimmed eyes, the curve on his lips unfamiliar but steady. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "We start rebuilding today. Shed can wait. First thing's getting more firewood, patching that window, and calling Ellie on the ham radio. She'll skin me alive if I let those stitches tear again." Lobo blinked, as if taking notes. "And when this storm passes," he added, "we'll try the meadow trail, slowly, together." He rubbed at one last tear. "Sound like a plan, Wolf?" Finally, her tail moved one deliberate thump, the loudest yes the room had ever heard. Jonah stood, joints creaking like cabin beams. He stoked the stove, laid fresh logs until flames roared new life. Light flared brighter on Lobo's coat, catching the gold in her eyes. Not just alive aware, anchoring him to here and now. No more drifting, for either of them. And as the morning fully broke pink and gold flooding the frost-dusted glass, Jonah allowed a quiet certainty to settle where fear had lived. Whatever future waited beyond the tree line, they would meet it not as two broken wanderers, but as one steadfast unit, bound by the moment a pair of eyes refused to close and a heart finally remembered how to feel. A weak winter sun had climbed midway over the ridge when the steady chuff of an engine clawed its way up the rutted track to Jonah's cabin. Fresh snow muted the sound, but Lobo's ears flicked toward it long before Jonah heard anything. She lifted her head from the blanket nest, nose working, tail making a tentative sweep across the floorboards. Jonah set aside the half-split log in his hands, wiped sawdust on his jeans, and stepped onto the porch, just as the old tan Subaru eased to a stop beside the mangled shed. Powder sprayed from underballed tires. The hood rattled to silence. "Doctor." Ellie Tran climbed out wearing a quilted jacket 2 sizes too big and an expression caught between disbelief and relief. "Lord, Jonah," she breathed, taking in the claw, scored siding, the toppled shed roof, the patched window, and finally the man himself grimed, unshaven, exhaustion etched in every line but upright, very much breathing. "When you didn't radio back, I thought I was coming for a body recovery." Jonah touched the brim of an imaginary hat. "Not today. Ellie's gaze snagged on the crimson smear still staining the porch rail, then on the ranger jacket visible through the open door. Her shoulders stiffened with professional urgency. "Where is she?" "Inside," holding her own. Ellie grabbed her medical bag from the passenger seat canvas bulging with supplies and followed Jonah through the doorway. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, antiseptic, and wet dog. The stove radiated a comforting heat that had chased the bite from the air. Lobo lay near the hearth, head lifted, amber eyes tracking Ellie's entrance with equal parts caution and curiosity. Ellie knelt, unzipping the bag. "Well, Wolf, girl, you look a sight better than the rumors." Jonah settled behind Lobo, resting a calming hand on her shoulders. "She saved my hide again. Bear came back 2 nights ago." Ellie's eyebrows shot up. "I saw the trail of blood on the road. Figured it was yours." "Mostly his," Jonah said, jerking a thumb toward the empty woods. Ellie let out a low whistle, snapping on nitrile gloves. Stubborn pair. She palpated gently along Lobo's flank, lifting the edge of the newly laundered jacket, eyes narrowing at the fresh sutures. "These hold?" "Second set," Jonah admitted. "Used your kit. Nice stitch work." She flashed him a quick, approving glance, then checked temperature, pulse, capillary refill. Lobo tolerated the poking, only twitching when Ellie examined the reopened shoulder wound. The vet flushed it with saline, applied a fresh antibiotic ointment, and began wrapping it in sterile gauze. "She's still running a low-grade fever," Ellie said, voice clinical yet soft. "Nothing dangerous if we stay on top of fluids." She produced a syringe, measured out a dose, antibiotics, pain control, twice a day. Jonah accepted the vials without comment, placed them on the side table where a neat row of medicine bottles already waited like sentries. Ellie eased back on her heels, stripping gloves. "He's stronger than he looks," she said, nodding toward Lobo. The dog flicked an ear as if correcting her pronoun, but settled when Jonah's hand resumed its slow stroke along her spine. Ellie's gaze shifted to Jonah Took and the bruised cheekbone, the cracked knuckles, the dark crescents under his eyes that no rest had smoothed. "So are you," she added quietly. Jonah met her eyes for half a heartbeat, then looked away, throat tight. Words felt unwieldy these days too, small for the storm behind the ribcage, too big for his scarred tongue. He settled for the simplest acknowledgement, a single nod. Ellie rose, dusting snow off her knees. "I brought more 4 fluids, high-calorie wet food, extra gauze, and coffee, real stuff, not that motor oil you brew." She set a thermos on the table with a clank, trying to keep it light, but her eyes kept drifting to the shattered shed visible through the window. "We need to discuss relocating her to the clinic once transport's safe." Jonah shook his head. "Not yet. Roads are ice. She panics in the truck. When she's stronger." Ellie studied him a long beat, reading the unspoken "I can't risk moving her" etched in the set of his shoulders. Finally she sighed. "All right, but radio me twice a day this time, and if her fever spikes, I come back with a stretcher whether you like it or not." "Fair deal." She softened, stepping closer to the hearth, hands outstretched to the warmth. "I leave pain meds that strong. You better take some yourself." Jonah shrugged, half-smile tugging. "H's remind me I'm still kicking." Ellie rolled her eyes fondly. "Stubborn." She turned back to Lobo, scratched under the dog's uninjured ear. "Your human's impossible, you know." Lobo's tail tapped once against blanket. Agreement or conspiracy? Jonah watched the interaction, chest loosening. In the flicker of firelight, a triad formed hefted not by blood or obligation, but by quiet, relentless care. Vet, soldier, wolf, girl, all alive when odds said otherwise. Ellie repacked her bag, snapping clasps. "You'll need fresh bandages tomorrow." "I'll manage," Jonah said, "but softer this time. Less a shield and more a promise." She slung the bag over one shoulder, paused at the door. "Snow's letting up. I'll try to plow the track midday, bring more supplies." "You too," she pointed from man to dog. "No heroics till I'm back." Jonah saluted with 2 fingers. Lobo answered with a faint, throaty woof that made Ellie grin despite herself. The door shut behind her, leaving a hush broken only by the crackle of fire. Jonah poured 2 mugs of Ellie's coffee, one for himself, one set to cool by Lobo's water bowl in a gesture of shared ritual. He sat beside her again, steam curling around his face, and listened to the Subaru fade down the track. "She's right," he muttered, offering Lobo a careful sip on his fingertips. "You're stronger than you look." Lobo licked the coffee-tainted water, then fixed him with that steady, anchoring gaze. He huffed a quiet laugh. "Me? We'll see." He clinked his mug gently against the enamel dish, a toast to new meds, to stubborn hearts, to the vet who believed in both. Outside, snow glittered in sudden sunlight, as if even winter had paused to nod at the resilience stitched into the cabin's beating core. Mid-afternoon light spilled through the cabin windows in soft, slanted bars, warming the pine floorboards where Lobo rested. A week had passed since the bear's retreat, and every sunrise had carried a small victory. Fever tapering, appetite returning, tail thumping a touch harder. Today's triumph arrived when Lobo placed weight on her bandaged leg, steadying herself without Jonah's hand beneath her chest. Jonah watched from the rocker, fingers wrapped around a mug gone cool. The sight landed harder than any rifle kick. He set the mug aside and crouched, offering silent encouragement with an open palm. Lobo took a second tentative step, Then a third stiff. Careful, but balanced. Pride flickered in her eyes, almost shy. Jonah's throat tightened. "Easy does it, wolf girl," he murmured. One step, then another. She turned, limped toward him. He guided her in a slow circle around the stove, each shuffle leaving faint prints in the fine layer of sawdust he hadn't swept. When she completed the loop without collapsing, he let out a breath that felt bigger than his lungs. "That's my girl," he whispered, rubbing behind her ear. She leaned into him, chest vibrating with a low, satisfied grumble. He tossed another split log into the fire, listening to it catch. Outside, wind combed the treetops, but the worst of winter's tantrum had passed. Sunlight glimmered on icicles like stained glass. Jonah settled onto the blanket beside Lobo, back against the hearthstones. She lowered herself, sighing as she stretched the healing leg. For a while they shared the hush-fire crackle, kettle hiss, ticking stove. Then words began to pull at Jonah, the way a splinter works itself toward daylight. He cleared his throat. "You know," he began, voice rusty, "I used to believe pain was a thing you buried. Put it deep enough, nobody else has to trip over it. Least of all you." Lobo blinked, nose twitching, listening the way only a dog can, ears and eyes and heart all focused on the timbre, not the vocabulary. "I wasn't always alone out here," he continued. "Had a daughter once. Nora." The name landed heavy, startling even him with its sudden release. "She loved snow as much as you do. Used to chase flakes, mouth open, like she could swallow winter whole." Memory brightened his eyes, then dimmed them. "Fever got her at 6. Gone before the thaw." He picked at a fray on the blanket. "I kept her mittens, red wool. Still got 'em in a box somewhere I don't open." Lobo nudged his knee with her muzzle. Jonah huffed a sad laugh. "Yeah, I know I should let go." He stared into the fire, embers winking like distant stars. "My wife, Samshi, stayed 3 more winters. Grief changes people in opposite directions. She needed noise. I needed silence. One morning she packed a single duffel, left her ring on the table, said the cabin felt like a mausoleum. She wasn't wrong." The rocker creaked in the corner, moved by a draft or a ghost. Jonah rubbed his palms together, warming ink-blue veins. "After that I lived by practicalities wood. Water, traps, maps. Stopped being a husband, stopped being a father. Stopped being a man, if being a man means risking love again." He glanced at Lobo, half expecting judgment. Instead, he found only that unwavering amber steadiness. She lifted herself, shuffled closer, and placed her paw across his wrist. Gentle claim, quiet solidarity. He swallowed the lump climbing up from his chest. "Then you came howling into my world well. Whimpering Gand, everything rigid cracked." His voice softened. "First night I thought saving you might square some debt I owed the universe. Now I see the universe was trying to rescue me too." Lobo's tail swept the blanket, slow rhythm against cotton. She rested her head in the V of his arm. Jonah exhaled, letting his chin touch the top of her skull. The smell of antiseptic had faded. Pine smoke and warm fur replaced it, soothing as balm. "Ellie says you'll run again by spring," he murmured. "Guess that means I better start clearing the north trail, make it less bumpy for your comeback." Outside the window, sunlight slid behind a cloud, dimming the room but not the stove's glow. Jonah felt a shift inside, subtle as meltwater under ice, something loosening its grip. "One step at a time," he repeated, more to himself than her. "That's how we'll do it." He eased up, coaxing Lobo to her paws. Together they navigated the modest length of the cabin, matching her slow pace, she trusting his shadow at her flank. At the far wall, a mounted topo map waited, dotted with pins from winters past. Jonah tapped a blank ridge near the edge. "Out there's a meadow full of wolf prints come April. Maybe we'll add a shepherd set this year." He glanced down. Lobo's ears tilted forward, curiosity sparking in tired eyes. They turned back, retracing steps. Each time Lobo's injured leg touched down, confidence painted a shade brighter across her stance. By the time they reached the hearth again, she sat without wobbling, tongue lolling in quiet triumph. Jonah rubbed the scruff of her neck. "Look at us busted things trying not to stay broken." In the silence that followed, something invisible shifted from tentative to true. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb, nor merely a shelter. It felt in the most cautious, fragile sense like a home rebuilding itself, log by log, heartbeat by heartbeat. Lobo laid her head on Jonah's knee, eyelids drooping but gaze never leaving his face. He brushed a thumb above her brow, where new fur was growing over an old gash. "Rest now," he whispered. "We've got miles to walk and stories left to trade. No more words needed." Snow sighed against the roof. The stove hummed, and in that modest symphony Jonah felt a long, numb place inside begin, finally, to thaw, one step at a time. Snow had long since surrendered to twilight when Jonah trimmed the final lantern wick and let the cabin slide into darkness. Coals glowed steady in the stove-low ember light that painted the rafters a warm rust. Outside, wind threaded softly through the pines, no longer rattling shutters or carrying the phantom roar of a wounded bear. It sounded, simply, like winter breathing. The cot sat against the far wall, quilt freshly shaken, thin mattress restuffed with cedar shavings that murmured faintly of forests beyond these logs. For weeks, Jonah had slept in half-fetal tension on the floor, rifle within reach, boots still laced, one ear tuned for bell wire or claw. Tonight, something inside him dared a quieter ritual. He set the Winchester in its rack-oiled, cleaned, unloaded. The clack of the latch closing echoed calm rather than alarm. Then he unbuckled the harness knife from his belt and hung it by the door next to Ellie's clipboard of medication times. A rare unclenching spread through shoulders and spine, as if invisible armor finally slid from his frame. Lobo watched from her blanket near the stove, head tilted, eyes tracking each small surrender. She'd completed 2 circuits of the room that afternoon, walking more sure-footed than Jonah could have hoped for so soon. The limp persisted, but strength took root in muscle and spirit alike. Now she rose as low but confident and padded toward the cot, nails clicking lightly on pine. "Making sure I don't chicken out?" Jonah asked, a smile ghosting across his face. She huffed, tail-tapping once, then curled into a crescent beside the cot's wooden leg. Jonah knelt, fingers trailing through her fur where shaved skin met new fuzz. The wound was healing clean. Ellie's latest visit had promised stitches out within days. "You stand watch, I'll stand down," he whispered. "Deal?" Lobo's eyes half closed. She bumped her nose against his wrist in assent. Jonah extinguished the lantern. The room settled into ember glow only. He eased onto the cot, quilt pulling over weary limbs. Spring squeak at a sound he'd avoided for fear of noise, but tonight it felt like a lullaby. He lay on his back, hands folding over chest, gaze drawn to the knotty pine ceiling where faint ember light flickered like distant constellations. He listened. Wind brushing shingles, stove ticking, Lobo's breathing slow even. No jangle of bells, no crack of branches, no phantom cries haunting the timberline. Just wind, nothing more. Jonah's eyelids grew heavy, yet a part of him waited for the old reflex bolt upright, pulse hammering, phantom gunmetal in hand. It didn't come. Instead, memory drifted to Nora's lullaby soft humming in a child's off-key courage, and Sam's laugh chasing dust motes in a sunlit kitchen. They settled over him, like the quilt. No longer knots of pain, but threads in a wider tapestry. Somewhere in the drift toward sleep, he murmured, "Safe, kiddo?" The weather to Nora beyond the veil or to the shepherd beside him, he didn't know. Lobo inched closer, chin resting against the cot frame, one paw outstretched until it brushed the quilt's edge-tiny contact, tethering them both. Jonah's lips curved in the dark. His fingers found her paw and rested there, palm up, open. The wind shifted, rattling an eave just enough to test them. Lobo's ears twitched. Jonah's fingers tightened briefly around her paw and both eased as silence resumed. They breathed, reset, released. Minutes softened into the first true hour of rest Jonah had tasted since the faint cry in a frozen woods changed his life. Dreams came gentle ones, tinted in emberlight. No bears, no gunfire, just the hush of snowfall, and a pup weaving between cedar trunks, turning back now and again to be sure he followed. Near midnight, the fire thudded as a log split, startling sparks. Jonah stirred, but didn't wake. Lobo raised her head, glanced at the stove, then at the man. Seeing no fear in his face, she sighed and settled again. Guard eased into trust. Outside the cabin, the moon slid across a crystal sky, silvering branches and smoothing every scar in the snow. Inside, 2 survivors slept the rifle at rest, the wind a lullaby, and the world, for this single night, utterly absent of threats. Morning would bring chores, another dressing change, maybe memories that still stung. But none of that mattered now. Now there was only the quiet proof of Breathman and Dog Hand, the profound relief that edged each exhale. For the first time in weeks, fear had no claim here. And Sleep Deep, whole and undeservedly sweet-wrapped them both in its uncomplicated mercy. Spring came quietly to Bitterroot first, through melting icicles, then silver rivulets trickling down the hills. The air lost its icy edge, replaced by the scent of thawing earth and cedar. Snow retreated into the tree line, revealing patches of green. Jonah stood on his porch, watching the season stir. The new cedar siding on the shed gleamed golden. Beside him, Lobo padded out, no longer gaunt, her fur thick again, though her limp remained like a soft metal of survival. "Ready to check the creek?" he asked. She answered with a wag of her tail. They walked the soft trail together, his boots squelching, her paws silent. When they reached the brook, Lobo bounded in, splashing like sunlight through shattered glass. Jonah laughed freely, a sound unstuck from long silence. Back on shore, she shook herself dry, baptizing him with joy. "Consider me blessed," he said, smiling. They followed the creek past red willow shoots, paused to study tracks in the mud ear. Rabbit, fox. Lobo sniffed each one, cataloging the scent of a world reborn. At home, they shared lunch on the porch, venison stew for him, chicken and rice for her. The cabin, once hollow with grief, now throbbed with quiet life. Paw steps, stories, a second mug on the shelf. Later, Jonah pulled out a harmonica untouched since Sam left. The tune wavered, then steady, done finished but alive. Lobo rested beside him, her limp no longer a wound but a mark of journey. In the hush of evening, Jonah no longer feared the woods. He felt only thanks for the limp, the laughter of water, and the paw prints beside his own. Rumors drifted through the valley like smoke about the man with the shepherd, the one who fixed up a broken dog and maybe, just maybe, got fixed himself. Jonah felt the ripple each time he rumbled into Kalispell for feed or suture refills. Heads lifted, nodded. Strangers held doors a beat longer than courtesy required. But the attention, gentle as it was, never settled on him because Lobo, walking at his knee, drew every eye. Her limp marked each step, yet her carriage was proud, tail swaying like a banner of hard-won survival. "Good to see you, Jonah," Ellie said one bright Saturday as the Subaru's bell announced their arrival at the clinic. She knelt, palms out, and Lobo sniffed, offered a polite woof before accepting a scratch beneath the collar Jonah had fashioned from braided paracord. "And you, warrior princess, ready for your checkup?" Jonah followed them into the exam room, the place that once echoed with crash cart urgency, now carrying only the clipped notes of routine. Ellie weighed Lobo 3 pounds heavier. She examined the last faint scab, rotated the once shattered leg through gentle arcs. "Range of motion looks good. Scar tissue's pliant. You two have been doing your homework." Jonah shrugged, but pride flared in his eyes. "She insists on laps around the meadow." "Hell," Ellie grinned, scribbled notes. "Keep at it. Another month, you might forget she ever limped." She tossed Lobo a liver treat, then gestured toward the waiting area. "I've got one more patient could use your expertise." Jonah frowned but followed. In the lobby sat a boy of maybe 9, freckles lost beneath a mop of wheat blonde hair. He clutched a frayed leash with no collar attached. His sneakers worried divots into the mat. At the sight of Lobo, his eyes widened hope and hurt in equal measure. "Evan," Ellie said softly, "this is Mr. Ridge. And that's Lobo." The boy's gaze stayed fixed on the dog. "She's the one who fought the bear?" Jonah's mouth twitched. Bear fought her, really. Evan swallowed. "My dog, Scout, ran off in the ice storm last winter. We looked for weeks." The unfinished sentence hung like frost in the air. Lobo stepped closer, sniffed the boy's outstretched hand, then nuzzled into his palm. Evan's shoulders dropped. Breath he'd been holding escaped in a shaky gust. Jonah crouched beside them. Storytelling had never been his craft, but something about the boy's raw gaze loosened the knots around his history. He spoke quietly of a whimper in the woods, claws in the snow, a truck fishtailing toward Mercy. He kept the edges honest, the flatline, the reload, the tier of stitches under a bear's paw. The clinic hummed around them, phone ringing, Ellie moving charts, but the world narrowed to boy, man, dog, and the gravity of words shared. Evan traced the thickened scar along Lobo's shoulder. She didn't give up. Neither did you, Jonah said. You keep that leash. You keep looking. Sometimes what's lost finds a way back. The boy's eyes shimmered. He nodded, hugging Lobo once before his mother called him to their appointment. The leash dangled from his fist like a promise renewed. Ellie approached as they watched the boy disappear behind the exam door. Not bad for a man of few words, she teased. Jonah rose, dusting sawdust from his jacket. Kid needed truth more than quiet. Lobo leaned against his leg. Ellie scribbled a final note on the chart. Town's talking about starting a spring fair. They want you and Lobo their safety demonstration on wildlife encounters. Jonah's instinct was retreat, but Lobo looked up, tail sweeping the linoleum. He exhaled. We'll think on it. On the drive home, June's sun chased shadows across the road. Jonah cracked the window. Warm wind ruffled Lobo's ears. He recalled the boy's small arms hugging scarred fur and realized this, too, was a milepost on their shared map, another step away from silence. Back at the cabin, Jonah unloaded seed for the garden they would plant together. Lobo nosed the burlap, sneezed, then trotted almost trotted toward the meadow path. She paused, glancing over her shoulder, eyes bright with invitation. Visitors, stories, gardens, Jonah mused, grabbing the spade. Whole lot of new for two old souls. He followed her into budding green footprints alongside paw prints, pressing fresh stories into thawed earth rumors no longer, but living proof carried on the wind for anyone ready to listen. The trail to Flathead Lake wound through a stand of young aspens just leafing out, their new greens trembling like tiny prayer flags in the afternoon light. Jonah walked it slowly, hands tucked into pockets, bootfalls soft on damp earth. Beside him, Lobo kept Pacino hurry, no limp strong enough to break rhythm. Her ears flicked at each bird song, but her gaze stayed forward, toward water flashing between trunks like a piece of mirrored sky. They crested a low knoll, and the lake opened wide-thawed now, slate blue under high clouds, fringed by spruce and the last patches of snow clinging stubbornly to shaded coves. Jonah drew a long breath, filling his lungs with cedar, silt, the faint sweetness of budding willow. Months ago, the same air had cut his throat with ice. Now it settled warm, almost forgiving. He stepped onto a flat granite shelf above the shoreline, the rock warm from sun. Lobo followed, lowering to her haunches with a sigh that sounded suspiciously content. Together they looked out over the water, its surface riffled by a steady breeze that smelled of distant mountains shedding winter. Jonah broke the silence first, voice low but sure. You know, he said, not taking his eyes off the shimmering expanse, that first night I carried you, I thought we were both one bad turn from disappearing. He shook his head, a wry smile creasing weather-beaten skin. Turns out disappearing was the one thing we couldn't do. Lobo leaned against his thigh, tail sweeping the rock once quiet agreement. The collar of braided paracord glinted where the sun caught its weave. Jonah crouched, resting a palm on her shoulders. We were both left behind, he said, and the words landed with the weight of truth finally named aloud. A father without a child, a dog without a handler, two heartbeats misplaced by an indifferent world. He looked across the water where sunlight splintered into bright shards, dazzling but never blinding. But we're not lost anymore. The wind rose, brushing past them with gentle insistence. Months earlier, that same wind had stripped heat from his bones, carried distant threats on its howling edge. Today, it only ruffled Lobo's coat, teased the brim of Jonah's hat, and moved on, taking nothing with it. Lobo stood, placing both forepaws on the low edge of granite, sniffing lake air like she might file the scent away. Below, gentle waves lapped against thaw-loosened driftwood. Minnows flickered in shallows, clear as blown glass. Jonah joined her at the ledge. He pointed to a stone point across the lake, faint in spring haze. Nora caught her first trout right there, he murmured. Could barely hold the rod straight, but she fought that fish like it was a dragon. Memory tugged at him once, a sharp blade, now a bittersweet ribbon. He exhaled and looked down at Lobo. She'd have liked you. Lobo's gaze remained on the water, yet her body leaned closer, as if absorbing story through contact. Jonah scratched behind her ear. Minutes passed in companionable hush. Geese honked overhead, banking northward. Beneath them, the lake accepted their reflections, one tall, one four-legged, both scarred, both undeniably whole. Jonah straightened. "Come on," he said. "Let's see if the old rowboat still floats." He started along a game trail that dipped toward a small, half-hidden dock. Halfway there, he paused, glancing back at the rock shelf they'd just left. Wind skimmed over the granite, stirring only the quiet memory of boot tread and paw print. Nothing lost this time. He smiled, turned forward. Lobo bounded to his side, still a hitch in the stride, but vigor in every step. They moved together toward the water, toward the beaten skiff waiting to nose out into spring's wide blue canvas. As they went, Jonah felt the valley settle around them. No longer a wilderness indifferent to survival, but a home expanded by two pulsing lives and the promise of whatever stories, patience, courage, and second chances might yet unfold. And somewhere beyond the tree line, the wind kept moving now, merely a traveler, not a thief carrying news across the ridges that the man and the wolf dog at Flathead Lake had found exactly what they needed: a place, a purpose, and each other. Some bonds don't need words, just a quiet look, a shared silence by the fire, a heartbeat beside yours that says, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." That's what Jonah found in Lobo. And maybe, in some way, it's what we're all searching for too. German Shepherds have a way of teaching us about loyalty that runs deeper than instinct. It's about choosing to stay even when things get hard, especially then. That kind of love doesn't just protect us, it heals us. Reminds us we're not alone, even in our quietest winters. If you've got a dog, maybe one getting older, or maybe one you've just brought home, I found something recently that felt worth sharing. It's not flashy, just thoughtful help for building a better connection with your dog. If you're curious, you might look into it. Feels like the kind of thing you'd pass along to a friend, not something someone's trying to sell you. Whatever you do, keep listening to your dog. Sometimes they know what our hearts haven't found the words for yet. Take care of them, and let them take care of you, too.